Hi, good morning, all. Welcome to the Housing Actions Work Group for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, our 11th meeting. I'm Deb Myhoff with Communitas. I'm the facilitator of this group. Really glad you all are here today, and it looks like some additional folks are jumping in. I will go over the agenda and meeting flow and ground rules and the rest of it here in a minute, but why don't we go ahead and get started with some introductions? And let's start maybe with the DLCD team, and then we can move on to the consulting team and then HOG members. So Thea, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thea Croman, she, her. I'm a housing planner here with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Really glad to be here with you this morning. It's been a while. I'll pass it to Ethan.
Hey everyone, Ethan Stuckmeyer, manager of the housing division. Echoing thanks for being here today. Celestina?
Good morning, Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, housing planner here at DLCD. Good morning again. Let's go to Sean.
Hi, folks. Sean Edging, housing planner at the Housing Accountability and Production Office at DLCD. And I'll pass it on over to Mari.
Good morning, everyone. Mari Valencia Aguilar. Happy Wednesday. Share they pronouns. Looking forward to the discussion. I think I'll pass it over to my colleague, Ingrid. Over to you.
Morning, everyone. Ingrid Cordell, admin support for the housing team at DLCD. I think it's back to you, Deb.
Great, thank you. Sean? Did you introduce yourself? Sorry.
Yes.
I
I'm
got
sorry.
distracted.
Totally.
Boy, that is terrible. Sorry about that. And then how about Commissioner Lazo?
Good morning, all. Alan Lazo, LCDC Vice Chair, he, him pronouns. Good to see y'all.
Good to see you. And I know we have Talia with OHCS.
Hey everyone, Talia Concrevis, she, her pronouns, Assistant Director for Homeownership Programs at OHCS.
Good morning, glad you're here. And then did I see, yeah, Aurora, are you able to introduce yourself, please? Maybe she's not on quite yet. We can circle back. Anyone else with state agencies that I missed?
Hi, sorry, my unmute button wasn't
There you
working
go.
for some reason. My name's Aurora. I am a legislative and policy analyst with the department. I focus on housing and urbanization policy. Great to be here with you all this morning.
Great. Thanks, Aurora. Glad you're here. All right, I'm going to move on to the consulting team. Why don't we start with Lorelei?
Hi, everybody. Lorelei Gentinen with Echo Northwest. You'll be hearing more from our team than usual today, for better or worse, and it's great to be here with you all. Becky?
Hi, all. I'm Becky Hewitt, Project Director with Echo Northwest, she, her pronouns. I'm looking forward to hearing this conversation. I'll pass it over to Madeline.
Morning, everyone. Madeline Miller here with Echo Northwest, Senior Project Manager, and I'll be off camera today. Not a lot of speaking for me today, but I'll be taking notes. I'll pass to Ian.
Hi, good morning. Ian Carlton with Echo Northwest and Senior Economic Advisor.
Good morning, Ian. Glad you're here. All right, I'm going to move on to our HOG members, and I'm going to attempt to do this alphabetically, starting with Anne, please. Good morning.
Good morning, Ann Catlin with the City of Albany. I'm a comprehensive planner there.
Great. And Brianne?
Brianne Gale, Senior Long Range Planner with City of Bend.
Thank you. Brock?
Hey everyone, Brock Nation, Policy Director, Oregon Realtors, him.
Great. Gust?
Good morning, everybody. Gus Chachis, GCT Land Management, Land Developing and Consulting.
Thanks, Gust. Julia?
Hey, good morning, Julia Metz, she, her pronouns with Sightline and Thousand Friends.
Great. Karen?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Burig. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager with Clackamas County.
Kathy?
Kathy Wild, Housing Land Advocates, both REC and HOG.
Glad you're here this morning, Kathy. Thank you. And Mac.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. Matt Cunningham, Housing Developer, Community Partners for Affordable Housing.
Thank you. Mary Kyle.
Mary Kyle McCurdy, 1000 Friends of Oregon. I have to step away from about 10:30 to 10:50, so just
Okay.
I'll be gone then. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for letting me know. Matt.
Hi, this is Matt Sears. I'm the Public Policy Director with the Oregon Council for Developmental Disabilities, and I use he, him pronouns.
Thanks, Matt. Michael.
Hi, Michael Anderson with Sightline Institute. Him or them. I'm going to be up and out and about as well, so may have some breaks in my ability to talk.
Okay. Thanks for the heads up on that. Rachel.
Morning, Rachel Bidu. I'm with the Network for Oregon Affordable Housing.
Thank you. Shannon.
Shannon Billhauer, she, her pronouns, Executive Director, Habitat for Humanity of Oregon.
Great. I think that's it. Is there anyone I missed that came in late? Okay. Thank you all. Let's get cooking. Thea, if you could pull up the slides, I'll review quickly the meeting agenda, and we can get moving.
Are you seeing the slides?
I am seeing the first slide. Yep. Yeah.
Here we are.
Great. And if you could go on to the agenda, that'd be great. Excellent. Thank you. So as Lorelei mentioned this morning, Echo Northwest will be doing a bit of presenting of the information you received in your packet. We'll have discussions about some of their analysis and their take on the findings, and your perspectives on all of that with regard to the HPS action selection and compliance pathways therein, and also with regard to the contextualized housing need assumptions and potential compliance pathways. So this is a continuation of conversations we've had with you all many times, but sort of advancing it beyond that. And it'll be a little different this morning in that you'll be hearing primarily, Echo will be the primary presenter. DLCD is in listening mode. You won't be hearing much from DLCD staff this morning. They'll be quietly paying attention and dialing into the words that you are sharing and the thoughts and perspectives you're sharing. So we look forward to that. We just, if you didn't have a chance to notice in the agenda, the analysis is presented with the contextualized housing need first and then the HPS actions second. We are inverting that for the purposes of our discussion today, to make sure we give adequate time to really have a deeper conversation about HPS actions, because we've not talked about those quite as much as the contextualized housing need, but we have adequate time for both, we believe. And I think that's it for meeting agenda. If we could go on to sort of responsibilities and expectations of our meetings. As always, we ask you to come in here and act in good faith as we are, and ask for assistance as you need it. If you need technical assistance or having trouble hearing or any of those things or connecting, Ingrid is your person. And if you have other questions or things you'd like to chime in about, please enter the conversation for that. Ground rules, we ask you and ask ourselves, of course, to honor the agenda and stay on topic. Allow for a balance of speaking time. There are a number of you that we hear from less. We'd like to make sure that you have adequate time to speak up and feel comfortable, and I welcome that. And of course, we request that you listen with respect and avoid any personal attacks, keeping on the issues at hand. And then, the rest, I think you all know quite well. Please learn and understand other perspectives. We are not here to try to come to the same perspective or opinion on these things. We assembled this group very specifically to come with a broad and diverse opinions. Some of them will be divergent. We just ask you to be respectful of others' opinions and making yours known. And I think that's enough. We'll carry on as we always do. Thank you all. And I'm going to hand it over to Thea to run us through the racial equity framework for decision-making ideas for today.
Thanks, Deb. So as you all know, we'll sort of ground this discussion in our racial equity framework for decision-making that our commission has asked us to sort of center in all of our rulemaking. For this session, we're going to be focusing on data equity and data justice and accountability. In this slide, I'll just walk you through what those actual questions are. So for data equity and data justice, are the data and research you're using for your analysis framed with a data equity and data justice focus? If no, where might you obtain this data? If data equity and data justice resources are not available, what would you suggest as a way to obtain this information? Is there qualitative data available? And I just want to point out that this element is really important in the conversation today, because we're going to be digging into analysis in a way that we maybe haven't done before, into analysis that is attempting to ground some policy decisions in the data that are available, and using that data to inform the directions of the rules. So I want to make sure that we keep this in mind as we listen to the presentation and move into that discussion. Also, wanting to focus on accountability. So how does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? What are the accountability measures for local government for this rule? How will DLCD track compliance? And what are the incentives and disincentives for not meeting compliance? Do the accountability measures include engaging with communities? If yes, how is this done? If no, why? What are the challenges and opportunities for accountability for DLCD and local government? And what are some ideas to address this? And this factor is also going to be pretty critical in talking through compliance pathways, both in the contextualized housing need, in the housing production strategy elements, and also in the acceleration program, if and how to weave a compliance pathway through to the acceleration program. So all of this should sort of provide the basis for the conversation today, as well as all the others, but I just want to sort of pull out those two specifically. All right, back to you, Deb.
Great, thank you very much. And I just want to acknowledge a couple of other folks have come into the room, and maybe you all could take a quick moment to introduce yourself. Alexis.
Oh no, my camera's not turning on, but I'm not a black void. My name is Alexis Hammer. I'm the legislative and policy manager at DLCD.
Thanks, Alexis. And Ariel?
Hi, good morning. Ariel Kane, economic planner at the City of Portland.
Good morning. Glad you all are here. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Lorelei with Echo Northwest to first they're going to give sort of a big overview presentation. Well, not big presentation, but a high level overview of the analysis. We'll take a moment to see if you have any questions about the analysis before we get into the specifics of the HPS actions. So Lorelei, take it away.
All right, cool. Thanks, Deb. So yeah, just a few quick framing points. First of all, what we've been asked to produce and send to you all was long. So thanks for those of you who were able to wade through it. There was a lot of data appendices that probably didn't need your quite as much focused attention, but hopefully you had a chance to at least kind of breeze through the first bits of it. This work started with some very focused questions from the state at the beginning of May. Essentially, they asked us to bring forward some data on a set of very specific questions so that they could kind of sort through that information in the process of starting to write rules. That's what we did. That's basically the data appendix. And then they said, all right, you guys, you think you're so smart. What do you think we should do with this information? How would you create compliance pathways given the way that we've been talking about them in each of these specific areas? And that was the genesis of the memorandum. That will be the focus of the next couple of hours. We use the word recommendations, but I hope you all are able to hear that we are holding that word very lightly, and we hope you do as well. Those recommendations haven't had the benefit of this conversation that we are about to have. And in some cases, we even internally had some differences of perspective on what the best path forward would be. So as we're going through the presentation, we'll try to kind of highlight some of those choice points so that you can understand our thinking. But essentially, this is meant to be a starting place for what we hope will be a reasonable conversation, given the questions that were asked of us, the data that was available, and what we've been able to see in the discussion with the HOG to date. I also want to be very clear that we know that the problem of compliance is a different problem from many different angles, right? We work with a lot of you on HCAs and HPSs, and we know that most cities are really just trying to do the right thing. What those cities need is good information and rules that provide the right framework for them to be able to build from that framework to put in place a set of policies that will help to advance housing production. But we also know that a lot of cities would be really happy to have the state as a bad guy. And we also know that there are some cities that have elected leadership that really is resistant. Each of those problem sets kind of requires a different solution in the rules. We tried to take that into consideration as we thought about the concept of compliance pathways, but I anticipate that this discussion will really help to sharpen that, because each of you, to the extent that you're capable of doing that, if you can think about those different kind of issues and different needs for resolution as you're going through the conversation, I think it will be very helpful. So big picture, these are recommendations only as a starting place. That's how we see them. I know that's how DLCD sees them. They are going to take this conversation and what we've put together and create a set of rules that I'm sure will look very different from what we've proposed, at least in part because of this conversation, and hopefully better with the benefit of more thinkers. So our hope is that this moves the conversation forward. There's really no way to avoid trade-offs. The choices, there are policy choices here that are going to have unintended consequences. So we just need to kind of keep that in mind as we go through the conversation. So that's the framing that I've got. Becky, Ian, anything you want to throw into the mix before we dive into details? No? Okay. Deb?
Keep going.
Okay, I think we can hand it to Becky then.
Okay, and I'm actually going to let Ian lead off to talk about the first part of our analysis in the analysis we did that to inform the HPS action selection. So I'll pass it to Ian.
Great. I think we can jump ahead to the first slide where we were asked a series of research questions, and I phrase it that way, research questions, to explore things and to come back with information to inform decisions. That is what I'm going to share with you, is some of that analysis, the approach, and some of the high-level conclusions, which hopefully you've had a chance to review in greater detail in the documents. But these are, as Lorelei said, intended to be data points to inform decision-making. What we are presenting here, obviously, is based on the latest and greatest available data, which is always incomplete. And keep that in mind as we go through this, and adding your perspectives to it will be very valuable. So the next slide is a series of steps that we went through to address the questions that were, the research questions that were raised, specifically trying to analyze housing development opportunities across the state and where they existed, where land use actions could have an effect and where land use actions might not be effective, and trying to discern even within places that land use actions might have an effect, would they be differentially impacting one community versus another? So the first step in this was defining a set of prototypes that could support the policy objectives that have been framed for us as part of this process. And those prototypes are housing developments that you could imagine existing in the real world, and there are examples on the ground somewhere in the state. We then tested the feasibility of these, and when we say feasibility in this case, we're talking about financial feasibility for the market to deliver. So market actors, profit-seeking actors, can they financially afford to deliver these? Can they gather the investors and lenders required to build housing that meets the policy objectives? And we asked the question, how does this relate to some high opportunity areas versus others? How does this relate to city size and the metro region, since those are categorizations where rulemaking is applied differentially? Then we conducted a zoning analysis to understand whether zoning currently on the ground is precluding some of these prototypes that would help achieve policy objectives. Is it precluding them from being developed? Therefore, would certain land use actions to change those policies potentially yield housing production? So this is the steps we went through, and I'll now walk you through each individual step. Defining the prototypes on the next slide, we looked at the policy objectives, 4 listed here, and a set of relevant housing prototypes. If you looked at the document, these are explained in a little bit more detail there, but hopefully these names are somewhat self-explanatory in that we're looking at different scales of housing and also some of the qualities of these housing. So when we're looking at neighborhood scale multi-unit housing, we're looking at something that is obviously multifamily, that is scaled to fit at the edge or within neighborhoods, single unit neighborhoods. And we then also evaluated variations on that neighborhood scale multi-unit housing with the mixed income components. So that would be, for example, deed-restricted housing within those neighborhood scale multi-unit housing to address affordable and mixed income housing objectives. We also looked at whether those scales of housing, that typology of housing, could accommodate multi units that are a different scale than what we typically see being delivered across the state. We're seeing a lot of 1 and 2s. Could we see more 3-bedroom units being built in these multi-unit housing typologies? And so that's a prototype. A prototype would be this multi-unit neighborhood scale housing with larger units to satisfy the demand that we have in the state for families seeking housing. So the prototypes serve these policy interests if they are developed. The question is, would they be developed if allowed? To move into that, we asked a question of each. Would they be financially feasible? Would a duplex, would townhomes, small multifamily, large multifamily, would all of the different prototypes be feasible in the varied submarkets that exist across the state? And when we ran this analysis, we were running pencil out pro formas the way that a developer would, the way that a developer communicates with their investors and their lenders to demonstrate to them that they should proceed with the investment. When we did run those spreadsheets, those pro formas, we were assuming that the sites for these existed in each submarket in the state. And we were also assuming a certain price that reflected local market conditions. So the land price, the ability to pay for land by a developer, varied across the state based on what we've seen in the marketplace. And when we conducted that analysis at the outset with localized rents and localized prices, we quickly found that very little is currently feasible to develop that would achieve investors' risk-adjusted return requirements under today's lending environment. So all of these factors meant that we found very little wood pencil anywhere across the state. And so we had to take a step back and say, well, what could the future look like? What if things were more favorable in the future? And we started to evaluate the feasibility of these prototypes across Oregon under more favorable conditions with lower construction costs, higher prices, higher rents, lower borrowing rates. What if the market could change in the future such that things were feasible? Where would they become more feasible first? Where would they become more feasible later? Because conditions would have to improve even more. And that's what we really ultimately answered. On the next slide, the high level conclusions from this is that under current market conditions, very little was financially viable, but under more favorable market conditions, we quickly saw, as one might expect, that smaller prototypes that have a lower construction cost per square foot showed more feasibility across more submarkets than larger prototypes that cost more per unit per square foot to deliver. So larger prototypes requiring more expensive features according to building codes, harder to deliver. Now, some of those features are really important to us in this context because they're things like elevators that provide for accessibility. Those larger prototypes with elevators, more expensive to deliver, less feasible than the smaller prototypes. Now, also under more favorable market conditions, we saw some patterns emerge between large metro cities versus medium cities, where if something was feasible in a medium city, it was probably going to be feasible in large and metro cities as well, because those markets have more higher prices and rents, so the demand is greater, and the construction costs aren't that much greater than the medium cities across the state. So that differential meant more feasibility across those large and metro cities when we saw some feasibility in medium cities. We also saw that when we saw things being feasible, these prototypes being feasible in large metro cities, Portland, the city of Portland, was consistently among those cities where it was most feasible because of that factor of higher demand, higher rents, higher prices, making it more feasible to deliver these prototypes. Across the board, the very large prototypes, the ones that we would think of as buildings that someone might build utilizing an affordability density bonus or a family-sized unit density bonus that would have elevators in it. Those showed relatively little feasibility under these favorable conditions when we looked outside of the city of Portland and the Portland metro area. So there's our high-level findings. To summarize it for you in terms of those prototypes that we tested, if we go to the next slide, we've highlighted on the left here the policy objectives with the corresponding prototypes to the right. We've divided it into the results for medium cities and large and metro cities. And if you see something highlighted here, it's because there were some submarkets in medium cities where compact middle housing was feasible. It doesn't mean it was feasible everywhere, but some places showed compact middle housing prototypes penciling out under these favorable market conditions. The same is true for the adaptable middle housing. In large and metro cities, we saw, as I said, many more of the prototypes penciling out. Now, this means for us considering policy that if we were to, say, upzone for 65-foot tall multifamily buildings in medium cities, it might be some time before market conditions would be supportive of developers delivering that type of market-oriented housing in medium cities. It is going to be sooner that it's delivered in the large and metro cities. That's what we're we're finding with this analysis, and it helps us think about how you would tailor policies towards what might actually be feasible in each of these submarkets. I think critical to this, passing it off back to Becky, is what we found when it comes to enabling these. If you look at this analysis as no zoning, there's no impediments to delivering these. We wanted to understand, well, are there impediments on the ground today in medium cities and large and metro cities? So the next slide gets into that piece.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so on the zoning side, because we do not have a statewide database of local zoning, we picked out 4 example jurisdictions where we could readily access GIS data on the existing zoning. We had some passing familiarity with how the zones work, enough to kind of make sure that we were sort of in the right ballpark of understanding what mattered in their zoning. And we did a pass through basically all of their zones, but with a focus on the residential and mixed use zones, including zones that were listed as commercial, but actually allow housing, to check for things like density, floor area ratio, minimum lot size, parking requirements, lot coverage, open space, a variety of key standards, and compare those against the physical forms that we assumed in the prototypes that Ian is describing. The prototypes that we analyzed, you saw some of them were called, compact or things like that. They tend to assume a pretty efficient site layout, not a lot of parking, not a lot of landscaping, not a lot besides sort of the building and the basics on the site. So that meant that, relative to other mixed use or other ways of building multi-unit housing, they're relatively higher density, higher lot coverage, higher FAR than maybe what a typical built example would look like in a lot of communities. So using those parameters, we identified which zones in each of our example communities would fully allow the prototypes. And if there were standards that were off by just a tiny margin, we had some sort of wiggle room within there, but it was off by a lot. We said, no, that would really preclude this prototype from being built. And then for those zones that did allow the prototypes, we said, well, what percentage of the land area do those cover in these cities, using their GIS data? And what we found is that for those prototypes that we studied as physical forms that could potentially help meet the policy objectives, they were prohibited a lot more often than they were allowed. The barriers varied between the communities, but density, mostly maximum density, occasionally minimum density, height limits, lot coverage, open space requirements, those came up a lot. And so not every community had all of those barriers, but most of the communities had some of those barriers, enough to make it so you couldn't build it exactly the way that we had assumed. It was a little different between our 2 larger cities. We looked at Salem and Tualatin compared to the 2 smaller cities, Hood River and Ashland, which is partly because of the way that our middle housing rules have required larger and metro cities to take more action to allow middle housing. So in those larger metro cities, we still saw barriers to multi-unit housing at a corridor scale and at a neighborhood scale, and down to like a 6-plex level. Basically everything that was above what is covered by the middle housing rules was really limited, basically to a couple of commercial and mixed use zones. Even the higher density residential zones often had some standard that did not allow for this more efficient format of those housing types. In the smaller cities, even almost all of the middle housing was basically not allowed anywhere at all with the standards that we assumed. They do allow middle housing, but not with the standards that we were testing. So that generally led us to that there really are still some regulatory barriers. This is just 4 cities. They're selected for convenience as much as anything. It's not like a representative sample in some statistical way. But it does suggest that across many jurisdiction sizes, there really are still some regulatory barriers out there. So what that left us with is that, relaxing some zoning constraints for multi-unit housing and middle housing that has specific characteristics, that's maybe a more kind of compact and efficient form of development, that could broaden the available development options, and that would, and in ways that could support the policy objectives. What Ian was describing suggests that in some communities that may not be enough. The market might deliver on that in some places, and it might not in other places. The smaller cities, in particular, the market may not respond to all of the options that would become available. But with a few caveats, removing regulatory barriers to housing is generally not something that has a lot of downsides. The 2 caveats there are it's important that phantom capacity not become an issue in the HCA, that upzoning and allowing and being more permissive of these housing types doesn't mean that all of a sudden we assume that all of it can be built. There are existing rules to address that, and the CowTAC is looking at that. It's just an important note that making sure that we don't sort of overassume what will occur just by allowing it to occur. That's important. And that we're not pushing jurisdictions to upzone to a level that is completely unreasonable in the foreseeable future in their market, because sometimes landowners are not running their own sophisticated pro formas, and they think, oh, well, all this is allowed. Why would I sell my land to somebody who's only going to build, who's going to underbuild this site? I'm going to hold out and wait for someone who's going to really maximize the potential of my land. And so that can sort of inadvertently create this obstacle. So at the extreme, there are potential downsides, but up to that point, there's really more benefit than harm, we think, in removing those regulatory barriers. That said, the impact is going to depend on the extent to which local regulations really differ from whatever's required. And that is it's different in every community, even if what we found is very limited places where you can do exactly this thing. How different the thing you can do is really varies between these communities. So the impact is going to differ, and it also depends on what their market conditions are. The other thing to take into consideration, Ian mentioned, we kind of assumed that in all of these places that like the perfect site exists, and and that's not really true in practice. So the more narrowly any sort of upzoning is targeted, especially if it's, the state trying to write rules about where you have to target things without really knowing what the local situation is. If that's more narrowly focused, the odds that you hit the sweet spot of land that is developable and high opportunity and has the right market conditions is relatively low. The broader that upzoning is applied and that opportunity is provided, the more likely it's going to overlap with places where that development can really occur and with places that you want that development to occur, including places that are high opportunity areas. So as Lorelei mentioned, these recommendations with a grain of salt, these were subject to much discussion internally. But where we landed as kind of a place to offer up for this group for consideration is this kind of combination for most of these needs or policy objectives of saying you have to do something about this need. You must take at least one action that is specifically focused on that need. The current rules are more like your actions collectively have to address your needs collectively. So putting a little bit of a finer point on, you have to at least do one thing that is specifically getting at these needs. These are important. And then saying a thing you could do is here's a land use thing you could do. And if you do this land use thing, we're going to assume that you have done enough. So creating a safe harbor that would allow you to check that box. The specifics of what we're proposing as or offering up as this recommendation vary between medium cities and large cities. In the medium cities, we have a little bit more of a focus on buildable land because the odds of redevelopment in our prior experience working with smaller jurisdictions, the odds of redevelopment tend to be less, and getting new options allowed on land that is buildable is maybe going to have a little bit more impact. In practice, it might be easier for jurisdictions to just update a whole zone. That's great. But the place where it's potentially going to have the most impact is the buildable land. In large and metro cities, we thought about buildable land and development ready land, as well as land within high opportunity areas, regardless of its development status. In large and metro cities, the distinction between a high opportunity area and a less high opportunity area is probably a larger geographic distance. Whereas in a smaller city, if the whole city is like within a half-mile, 1 mile radius of any given point, it's not as big of a deal necessarily to focus in on those high opportunity areas. So that's kind of the geographic thinking that goes into this. And the other piece that feeds into this is in medium cities, there's more of a focus on middle housing and the allowing multi-unit housing, just like sort of normal 3-story multi-unit housing in zones that are that allow basically upgrading the existing multi-unit standards to be closer to what's in the model code. In large and metro cities, pushing the middle housing standards further closer to where the new model code is as it stands now. And then for the multi-unit housing, pushing for the multi-unit standards, again, to sort of evolve towards what's in the model code in places that already allow multi-unit, but trying to make those more permissive. So that's kind of the general thinking on how this could work to set a land use specific compliance pathway. And basically, if the city's existing zoning already was consistent with this, then they would have to take some other different action. If they're already there, then do something more, do something else. That's the gist of the thinking there. On affordable housing, we were thinking that, zoning is great for affordable housing, but it really is probably not sufficient, even more so than other things. So 2 actions was the kind of starting point there. Do zoning and something else, pick something else of your choosing. But also here's a safe harbor that is a land use action you could take. And basically these amount to allowing that neighborhood scale multi-unit housing as a bonus or as an incentive in either all urban residential zones in the smaller cities or in specific residential zones that are basically the same zones that middle housing applies to. So allowing that neighborhood scale multi-unit housing as an affordability bonus in certain areas. For accessible housing, the new model code has some standards and some bonuses built in, and basically trying to encourage jurisdictions to look to those model codes and those bonuses and allow adaptable or accessible middle housing and multi-unit housing, if they're providing accessible or adaptable units, to allow them under standards that are consistent with those model codes, which are probably a lot more permissive than what the jurisdiction has on the books today. And then for family size units, for reasons we will get into when we talk about the CHN part, we really didn't see a lot of justification for specific land use actions on this, except that we have heard pretty clearly and consistently, including from members of the HOG, about the importance of allowing affordable housing to use a bedroom-based approach to minimum density rather than a unit-based approach to minimum density. And so because that has few downsides and has come up pretty consistently as important, we threw that out as something that could potentially just be a minimum requirement with no other specific land use actions tied to that specific need. So there's a lot in there. There's a lot of details. If folks have questions about the details, we can talk about them. But they're, as we said, sort of we're offering them up as an idea, a way to navigate this set of trade-offs. And we're really interested in hearing other folks' perspectives. I will unshare and we can see faces and talk.
Thank you, Lorelei, Ian, and Becky. Before we get into the meat of the discussion and your opinions and thoughts on this, I want to make sure we leave a little space to ask clarifying questions of what was just presented or the analysis itself. I see a couple hands, but I also had Michael reach out to me. I know I'll put him to the front of the queue. He has a clarifying question to kick us off.
Hey, thanks, Deb. So I just wanted to make sure I got it right. The table for the compliance pathways on multifamily and accessible, I think, it said such and such, apply these standards to such and such land. It didn't say to such and such land that's already zoned multifamily. But I thought I heard you say, Becky, that this was being applied to, you know, lands meeting these characteristics that is already zoned multifamily, and I'm pretty sure that's what the packet said. So that's a very important question I wanted to pin down.
Yeah, so I think the distinction there would be for the middle housing ones, it would apply to zones where middle housing are already subject to middle housing rules, and then the multi-unit ones would apply to I guess you'd have to think through how to actually write this in the rules, but basically zones where you are thinking you are going to get some of your multi-unit, you know, if you're going to look to that land in your HCA or that zone in your HCA as a place that is a source of multi-unit capacity, then it would be subject to, it would be a zone that allows multi-unit housing. And so taking those zones that already allow multi-unit housing and making them more permissive and more flexible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so there's no standard here that would, other than the HCA and the compliance process for the CHN, that would require a city to look at its currently low density areas and see should maybe these be multifamily.
Right. The HCA process would be where you would determine if you need to make more land.
Right. Okay.
Into places where you would get multi-unit housing.
Thanks.
Okay. Again, trying to stick to clarifying questions first. Mary Kyle.
Thank you. Thanks, Becky. That was really helpful in taking back through this long memo. As in one of the pathways, or a theme in a couple of these pathways, is to apply the large city middle housing zoning to the medium cities, for example, right? And there's kind of themes like that. But if I heard your analysis before that as to when you looked at sample cities, and although they're zoned for middle housing, it's not really feasible because of other things in their zoning code. I'm wondering if the suggested compliance pathway is actually enough, or if what's needed is an audit of that city's code to find the lurking barriers that will still exist, because I don't hear that just applying the large city to the medium city is necessarily going to solve the issue. I don't know enough about the model code that Sean presented in another meeting actually cures those lurking cobwebs. So I'm just not sure if that's going to do it. or if cities should actually, as part of their pathway or somewhere along the line, have an audit of their existing code requirements, where, you know, a setback or something else is going to make it really infeasible to do what you've zoned it for.
Just the quick clarification there is that a lot of the barriers that we saw in the small and medium cities related to middle housing are not allowed under even the current minimum
Right.
compliance for middle housing for large and metro cities.
Right.
So even moving them into minimum compliance for those bigger jurisdictions, they would have to, it wouldn't get them all the way to standards that are consistent with the prototypes we tested, but it would move them, I don't know, halfway there. It would make a difference in what they're allowing. Could you push further? Sure. I mean, the policy choices of how far you want to push their standards, but it would just moving to meeting what large and metro cities are already required to do at a minimum on middle housing would be a relatively big step forward for those smaller jurisdictions, because they don't have to do anything beyond duplexes today. So triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, cottage clusters, they can do kind of whatever standards they want on all of those housing types right now. And just moving the ball forward on that would be a relatively substantive change for them.
Yeah, I guess I'm just hearing this theme that there's stuff in local codes that really needs to be cleaned up, even to do what we thought we would get from legislation passed in the middle housing legislation passed in 2019. That seems like something that should also be done. So you've clarified that this isn't quite enough. It's an improvement, but it's not getting us all the way there to where we thought we would be with middle housing legislation. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. All right, still sticking with clarifications for now. Let's see if we can get through these quickly. Brock.
Yeah, actually, I'll tag on Mary Kyle real quick and just say, so for clarity, the analysis didn't look at what would be allowed under the passage of 2138 this year. This was based on pre-2138 law. So basically like January 1 this year, right?
This is based on their existing zoning code, whatever is currently applicable and on their websites. So also doesn't include, if they're midstream on a code amendment today, does not include that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The other, I guess this is kind of a clarifying question, but you noted let's see, it's in the policy and implementation considerations under the HPS section about the land price speculation of owners of, potentially partially vacant or vacant land that's already within the UGB, and noted how if it is overzoned beyond market capacity, they're likely to hold out in hopes of a better sales price to a developer when they eventually do. Have you seen anything indicating that the reverse is also true, wherein if a city told owners of those kinds of properties that they were going to bring in more developable land, that the owners then realize, okay, now the land that I have is not as valuable because the supply of land is going to go up, which therefore incentivizes me to sell for that infill or redevelopment to happen prior to that UGB expansion going through?
Can't say I've seen that specific situation play out. It's partly, I think, oftentimes the sites that haven't developed by the time the next UGB expansion is ready to hit, there's a reason why they haven't developed. And it's not necessarily, it may or may not have to do with the property owner's sort of calculus of pricing.
Yeah. So if we just isolate that property owner calculus, do you think that follows the logic that you've seen in your analysis?
I guess, have we seen that property owners would be more likely to sell their land when more supply is going to become available? Is that the question?
Yeah, essentially the logic that a property owner uses to say, okay, I'm going to hold out for, something better because they could put a duplex here or they could put a quadplex here, but they're only saying they're going to put a duplex here, right? Does that same logic work in reverse? of I'm going to sell because there's a risk that the value of the land that I have, because it's going to be a lower portion of the supply, is going to be less in demand and that price is going to go down.
Yeah, I guess I can't comment specifically on that. I haven't seen any specific instances one way or the other on that.
Thank you.
Michael, another clarifying question? Oh, okay. Shannon.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few. So my first one here is, and I think it was probably incorporated with Brock's question, but also HB 2258 just passed. And even if it's not known today, I guess I find myself wondering, do we think that could have an impact on making these middle housing standards more far-reaching already once it's implemented? That's just a question. And maybe there's no answer right now, so I'll just raise the question.
Right.
And I think that there were, from my perspective, some assumptions about home ownership that I'm concerned don't strike me as completely accurate. And there's also this specific definition that was given to neighborhood scale multi-unit housing that I'd like to push back on just a little bit. I'm a little concerned about asserting it has to be 3-story. I'm thinking about Foster Gardens that Habitat Portland region built. It was 40 homes on a 20-yard by 40-yard lot. That included fully accessible units, 2-story units. It was pretty dense. And it was more affordable than a 3-story development would have been. So I just like to push back on that standard a little bit, maybe. And then the other thing, I saw a couple times in this document the mention of like Oregon's terrible condo defect liability standards. We also just passed, through lots of hard work, HB 3746. Is it perfect? No. Was there some compromise? But is it worlds better once it gets known about and socialized? Absolutely. I wanted to affirm that. So that's good news to share. And then about some of these ownership assumptions, I felt like there was sort of this blanket in this memo, like, yeah, a lot of communities do single family homes and we know none of those can be affordable. I don't like that assumption. And maybe I'm wrong, but I felt like it was there. And also this and those homes just stay more affordable over time. I think increasingly in our state, there's a movement to embrace the community land trust and co-op movements, which keep these homes permanently affordable. So those are just what I felt like was maybe a set of assumptions about homeownership there did feel very uncomfortable to me. And I just wanted to name that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Julia.
Yeah. And hopefully my internet will continue to function. I keep getting some stability notifications. So
far, so good.
So I have a couple questions. The first one, in terms of where the minimum requirements are noted in the table, and then there's a reference to pick either 1 or 2 actions off of an HPS menu. Can you clarify which HPS menu we're talking about in that scenario?
Yeah, that would be a forthcoming menu that is under development. And so the future version of the HPS menu, which I know y'all do not have not reviewed, but knowing that there will be a guidance menu that will describe actions. And so
like the
assuming that emerges.
The cleaned up version of the larger multi-page HPS menu that was developed a few years ago, or is it like a completely, I guess I'm trying to grasp what it include beyond its like land use and incentives and programs and that one. Okay, cool. That's helpful. Thank you. And then this might be a question for Ian, but so I was noticing in the research questions that, and rightfully so, kind of there's a policy objective related to affordability and equity associated with that. But then I was kind of having a hard time following that thread through the analysis that was done in terms of more specifically just kind of acknowledging the term market rate developers is used consistently and mixed income is used consistently in conjunction with affordable housing. And I'm just wondering if nonprofit developers and regulated affordable housing, like capital A affordable housing, were kind of considered through this process. Because I was having a hard time seeing that thread through this, despite it being called out specifically as a research question. So I'm hoping I can get some clarity on that.
Our evaluation of affordability in this context was buildings with an inclusionary set aside. So we were considering deed restrictions on 20% of units, targeting 80% median area income. And that, calculus of a market rate developer taking 80% of their units at market rate and then cross-subsidizing 20% is what we considered. We did not consider the capital A affordable nonprofits because the geographic feasibility is limited by public funding sources, and the scale of the delivery of those units is also constrained by that same funding source more than it is by lending. Well, that may not be true at this moment. Lending may be a limiting factor there. In general, it's not lender and investor return that are limiting the delivery of those units. So,
okay. And so then in terms of then, and this might be for Becky maybe, but then in terms of acknowledging essentially that that was not part of kind of the market analysis, which I was guessing that was why, but wanted to make sure, are the policy output recommendations then lacking on that front, or were you accounting for contemplating affordable housing provision, like production in those policies? Because that does happen. And so I just want to make sure that that was being contemplated in the policies that are kind of being discussed once we get to the discussion part.
Yeah, so one example of that, the recommendations on affordable and mixed income housing encompass both a mixed income option and a fully affordable option. And in the model code, there are differential bonuses for those two levels of affordability. The summary recommendations, partly just for like, there was already a lot of complexity in there, don't include that specific nuance, but basically say allow, like it's sort of a chunkier density bonus, if you will, that applies to both, that you would be able to build neighborhood scale multi-unit housing if it is affordable or mixed income, that would be the thing. So offering affordable, fully affordable development, the same land use option, when we talk to cities about that, it's we try to clarify that is not an incentive, if you will, for affordable housing, right? It's not, if you're talking about 100% affordable, you're not necessarily incentivizing market rate developers to do a thing they wouldn't do. You're just creating a bigger option, a more flexible, more generous option if it's fully affordable that isn't available to everyone else. So that's how that shows up in the recommendations, knowing that the market feasibility analysis is not going to be a useful test for regulated affordability.
Okay, thank you.
And can I just give one other clarification on one of the things that Shannon raised, the neighborhood scale multi-unit housing. The slides probably made it sound like it was specifically 3 stories, but as a land use concept, the idea would be that you are allowing up to 3 stories, not that it inherently, you are allowing a neighborhood scale multi-unit building that could be as tall as 3 stories. That's sort of defining the upper bound of what we would call neighborhood scale multi-unit housing. So thanks.
And I'd say our results demonstrate, as we often see, that if you allow something larger, this smaller version that would fit under that allowance is often also feasible. So if 2-story is the most feasible thing under a 3-story provision, then that's likely what you're going to see built.
Thank you, and thanks for your patience. Alan, go ahead.
Thanks, Deb. And this is, I think it's a further clarification of part of Julia's question around the term you use in the table is specific actions related to addressing in the compliance pathway. But when I further read that in the memo, and so when I read that, I thought it meant, as you described, Becky, a specific item chosen from a menu list, a finite menu list, right? Meaning you have to choose one of these 10 things. But when I read the memo, it actually says, if the action is not identified in the HPS menu as supporting or potentially supporting the thing, the city would be able to describe how that action will overcome the barrier. So the city could actually, under the minimum requirement, could choose a different action and then defend that action as actually fitting the minimum requirement. Am I reading that right?
Yes, that basically the menu, if it's on the menu, if the menu says this thing can support this need, then that's sort of a like, yes, your action is specific to that need, you're good. If you have some action that you think you can justify how it addresses that need, how it addresses a barrier that is specific in your community, you can make a case for why that action is going to address this need specifically, even if it's not called out in that menu, just because local circumstances vary. So it's sort of creating it like maybe a rebuttal. It's not exactly a rebuttable presumption, but it's like, you can make a case for it, but these ones we have already said do specifically focus to that need. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And it's actually exactly the term I was going to use next is, when we portray the framework as minimum requirement and safe harbor, it feels less flexible than the rebuttable presumption. But that sentence actually makes it seem like, wait a minute, this is rebuttable presumption. And so when we boil it down to a table, it even, and when we have to convey it to the public, it feels like we've lost the flexibility that lots of folks have been asking for, including jurisdictions. So that's my concern in the way it's laid out. And it's not the way you laid it out. It's just, I'm assuming the way the program has been designed. So just wanted to bring that forward. And thanks for the clarification on how that works.
I would say there isn't like a perfect term for this, like low minimum bar, because even minimum requirement implies that if you do the minimum, nothing else is asked of you. And I think that like the specific compliance pathway name that goes with that is a little bit we struggled a little bit with how to name what that is as a compliance pathway. But yes, I think the simplified version of this loses that nuance that 2 actions or a certain number of actions that are either on the menu or you have a specific justification for.
I am give me 1 second, Mary Kyle. I think I'd like to move us into discussion and maybe we can do sort of clarifications as we shift into there, because I'm feeling that energy headed in that direction. And I just want to frame up the discussion real quick here, which is, we are really looking for you all to provide some feedback, which we've sort of started there, on some of the policy implications and pros and cons of the various compliance pathway ideas for local governments to select or have selected for them HPS actions to be taken. And this is all in the framework of, this really needs to be focused on addressing housing production and affordability crisis in Oregon through the lens of racial equity, as we've discussed specifically today, but also more broadly, through the lens of the ONA framework of production, affordability, and choice, and the various HOG policy objectives, as well as keeping in mind local government staffing and budgetary capacity. So with that, I'm hoping we can at least take the first 2 questions for a while, and I'll leave some time to talk about accountability. But first question is, in light of all these issues in our ongoing crisis. What's your perspective on the recommendations that ECHO has presented this morning, lightly presented this morning, for proposed compliance pathways for HPS action selection? And then which compliance pathways for zoning or land use actions do you think hold the most promise for reducing barriers and, sort of reducing barriers in a way that's not throwing everyone into unintended consequences that further burdens the system and maybe works in opposite directions? So, okay, with that, Mary Kyle, and of course, welcome clarifications along the way as well.
This might be bridging that clarification to the questions you're asking too. And I think this is kind of linking what Michael and Alan have been asking about. But so there's a to be developed, or it's under development, HPS menu, which is great. I'm looking forward to seeing that. So if a city, a medium city, for example, takes the safe harbor of implementing the new multi-unit model code for 50% of their land that currently allows multi-family housing. But if that city's contextualized housing need or equity considerations determine that that's not sufficient, is that where that thing that they, you do one thing and then you do this safe harbor, is that where that thing would be the through line between the contextualized housing need and this HPS? Is that where we would see that reflected? Am I making sense? Because someone earlier said, asked, why limit it to, if their current amount of multifamily zoned land isn't really very much, and they show through their contextualized housing need, for example, that they need more multifamily zone land to meet a variety of targets of income, densities, et cetera. Is that where that would happen? Is that where that would be required to be taken on that? You do one or two things plus the safe harbor. Would you expand the multifamily?
I think this is sort of a
lands?
sequencing question. The HCA is where you would decide if you need more land to be zoned for multi-unit housing. And then following
where does that show
determination,
up? Right. Where does that
So once
action?
you've made that determination of capacity and need for, how much buildable land do you need to have zoned for multi-unit housing, then this HPS requirement would say, okay, of the buildable land where you think you are going to have multi-unit housing, you need to apply standards to that land that are basically at least as permissive as the model code.
So that increasing the amount of multifamily zone land would have already taken place.
That need would have been determined as part of the HCA. And so I think there's if this concept made it to rule writing, that specific question of timing and does it apply to the land you will rezone or the land that's already zoned, I think the intention is that it would apply to the land you are relying on in the HCA to meet your multi-unit housing need, whether or not you have already rezoned it. So we didn't get into all of those rule writing language specifics, but I think you're calling out a point that the intention is that it would apply to land that you have determined you need through the HCA to meet that contextualized housing need.
It's, right. There's that through line. And where I'm sort of saying is then where does the city actually have that action? That would be a housing production strategy, that action to zone more land to allow this higher density housing. So it's in that sequencing, where does that happen? And you might not have the answer to that, Becky, or maybe I'll see it.
Yeah,
when
I guess
it's
that would be like a
out.
land use efficiency measure you determine, through the HCA. Anyway, I think there are some very good how the rules get written questions in there that are frankly a little beyond what we got to with this recommendation. So I think you're calling attention to an important relationship between the HCA capacity determination, the land use efficiency measures, and then how the HPS actions pick up from that and build on it.
Well, upzoning is clearly a housing production strategy. It's not just an efficiency measure. So efficiency measures are a subset, as someone said in the meeting last week, is a subset of that HPS. So I just, the through line, I'll have faith that it will show up.
Thank you for raising it. Julia.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to note, and I'll just layer in. I think that there are probably a lot of scenarios beyond expanding or upzoning that might need to be contemplated just in terms of how we're layering what's coming out of the contextualized housing need with any potential safe harbors, especially if it's safe harbors, I think, just to make sure that the safe harbors aren't undercutting known issues. And it's actually been one of the things that I've struggled with a lot in terms of thinking about safe harbors for the HPS is if your CHN is showing that you need to increase your affordable housing delivery by 100% or something, I don't know, but like the safe harbor that's in place for affordable housing would only deliver 25% increase. Like that's a problem, I think. And so I think, as I think everyone in this space knows, I've been like very pro like safe harbors or rebuttable presumptions in terms of just helping cities with capacity and things like that. So I think it's a good thing to offer, but I do think we need to be really thoughtful around how they might layer or build off of, like basically be able to scale based off of maybe what's in the CHM versus maybe being hyperstatic. The other thing I just wanted to note kind of more directly, I think, to the questions around equity, is part of the reason I was kind of asking a little bit about the affordable housing piece. And I think there are other folks in this space that will be able to speak to it better than me, and with more technical notes. But I just want to make sure we're acknowledging kind of like the known intersection of housing disparities. So things like with the accessibility components, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I know Alan Hines has mentioned something like, I think it's around 60% of folks who live with disabilities are in like the extremely low income level or something like that. It's a high intersection, as well as, of course, we know there are a lot of racial disparities in terms of access to housing. And so I'm just wanting to make sure, and with that income. And so I'm just wanting to make sure we're continuing to contemplate that in lifting up policies and ideally minimum standards and or safe harbors or rebuttable presumptions or whatever we use that reflect that, especially for that 0 to 30% AMI provision of affordable housing, which the market will never provide. Like it's just not gonna get there no matter how much housing we build, because that also requires services that the market will not naturally provide. That's why nonprofits exist. I just want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind in terms of the policies that we're setting forward or the kind of trajectory that we're setting forward for things that we're trying to guide cities toward to make sure that that scale of housing and that type of housing can exist. And I also know Shannon will speak to the affordable homeownership side because I feel like that's the other side of the spectrum that's like it gets really missed a lot in terms of, again, kind of this complex confluence of funding, land, and scale. And so just kind of wanted to call that out related to these intersections of equity and the people that we're talking about at the end of these units. Because I'm not, to be honest, I was having a really hard time seeing it in this document. So yeah.
Thank you for both of those, Julia. Appreciate that. Brock.
Yeah. One, I mean, Eco, great job with this analysis. I think this is fantastic. I would love to see this implemented straight through. The funny thing about Alan Lazo's comment, Commissioner Lazo, when I was writing out my table of like what the recommendations were, I actually wrote rebuttable presumption, even though it said minimum requirement. So I'll call it a rebuttable minimum requirement, right? I think that is absolutely the right way to go with either one or two actions for the middle housing, multi-unit, affordable mixed income, and accessible housing, as you guys recommended in your report. And I do agree that the diverse unit size would be a minimum requirement to allow it to be counted by bedroom 100%. I support all 5 of those recommendations. Recognizing the comment that Julia had made about the safe harbors and whether that's enough, I think that's why it's important that we go with the minimum rebuttable standard, right? Is go in, pick one of these actions, pick the one that best fits your city's need, or 2 of these actions, right? And if you don't think any of the listed options are, come up with your own, do a little demonstration that you are going to get at least as good results out of that, right? And put that in. I mean, that is what we have been pushing for in this since the beginning is, figure out what works in your local context, make sure that you're taking action that you need to take, but get it done. I think going with the safe harbor approach here is not the best way to go as far as the HPS, specifically because of the fact that one, this analysis, as Ian had noted, is based on market assumptions that do not currently exist, right? This is based on a more favorable market than we currently have. And so if we can get there, this is when that all starts to become more feasible. But right now, even less of that is. And so, I'll leave it there. But generally, as far as the, rebuttable minimum standard, I think that is exactly where we should go for those first four, and then the minimum requirement of bedroom count for unit size. So thank you.
Thanks for providing the opinion and perspective there. Mac.
Yes, hello, good morning. Sorry, I got a message just reconfiguring my screen. Okay, first and foremost, I want to say thank you so much for that inclusion of the flexibility for affordable housing developments and a bedroom density. It's been a drum beating for a while, and so seeing it in these documents, I'm really excited for that future. I have some other sort of comments within the document, of course, and within the summaries and recommendations in the safe harbor around affordable and mixed income housing. I'm concerned that that's not going to be enough for affordable, especially for those at lower affordability levels. I'm thinking below 60% AMI, at least by the definition that is currently in the document of a defined 3-story multi-unit development on small lots with 8 to 12 units. For affordable housing, and especially those lower income levels, you need that sort of scale of 40 units. And that's just for the initial application, but it's also really important for that long-term operation and stewardship of that property as an asset. If you have lower unit counts, especially at those lower affordabilities, it's really difficult for that property to cover the operating expenses of the property for both just day-to-day expenses, but also those longer-term capital needs when you got to replace the sewer system, the roof, the envelope, things like that. It just becomes incredibly challenging. And I'm afraid that that's not going to see the production at those levels like we would want to see. I also just think in general, I have some concerns about only being able to take like one action generally and not having to count. I don't really think that there's silver bullets often. And so just that's kind of a concern that I've had there. Within the model code flag, I still need to dig in, and I haven't quite memorized fully all those affordability density code increases. But I do want to flag that I would be hesitant of needing 100% affordable units in a development to unlock those. And that's because of the inclusion of manager units. Some affordable housing developers like to include a manager unit within a property. And so that could be 1, maybe 2 units, depending on the scale. And so a threshold of 90 or 95%, I think would be more appropriate there, just to make sure you're not inadvertently missing any of those development opportunities there. And I think that's kind of just where I want to keep it for right now. Again, just flagging that for those lower affordability levels and for folks who need services, it's really that higher unit count of a minimum of 40, if not higher, especially in high opportunity, high land value areas. That's going to be necessary to see that delivery. Thank you.
Thanks, Mac. High level stuff and some specific details. Appreciate that. Michael.
Hey, I will start with things I like about this. I love the fact that it uses the model code rather than trying to reinvent a zoning wheel. The model code is a great resource. I love the step down to the middle cities as sort of a different option for the larger cities, and so on for the middle cities, stepping down to the smaller cities. That seems like an elegant way to do it. To Mary Kyle's point about the does it address the setbacks or whatever, the little details of it? I think the model code actually does. I could be missing something, but I feel like the model code's a really useful tool that's in place, being developed, and sort of does the services of a code audit for the most part, all the basic things that code audit would need to do in itself. So I think that's a great resource to draw on. I love how this set of compliance pathways includes land use at the heart of it. It is completely needs to be part of it. It is not the entire story, but I'm glad that we're really finally talking about here's how the land use piece would work. Here's how the other pieces would work. Or this is weak on the other pieces. As Julia mentioned, we need to get that list and figure out what is on that list. Is that an acceptable list? Is it, going to work for different kinds of cities? and so on of like other land use actions, but I like the general model of sort of land use +1 as like a standard for the state to look to for cities to do land use and then another thing or something like that. To build on Brock's point about like it being good to have flexibility at some flexibility at the HPS stage for different cities to find their own paths. I agree with that principle. The downside of that, the trade-off that the eco speakers identified, is that you then like open the door to people doing like the least impactful thing because it checks the right box. And so it just increases the need to have an accountability mechanism in the acceleration program that is really specific and like serves as a backstop of like, no, we really need to make this HPS thing work because the accountability program, we have some specificity in that tells us we're going to have to do hard stuff then. So let's really have a hard conversation now on our own terms so that we can do a good HPS instead of having to kick that off into the accessibility. But that only will happen if there's a lot of certainty that the accessibility program is going to swing into action for sure if a city doesn't do things. And so that's why we've been hitting over and over again the need for a very specific compliance in the accessibility program. Relates to the accountability. Not like utterly specific, but more specific than the HPS, more specific than a safe harbor. And I want to echo Julia's and Mac's points about you just need to allow bigger buildings for affordable housing in many cases. And it's not only that that's especially needed in the high opportunity areas because land values are higher, it's also that that's where the funding is from OHCS. And so like that's an extra important thing to think about. Generally speaking, I feel like this was a big step forward. I'm glad to be poking holes at it rather than poking holes in the void. So thanks a lot for all your work on this.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And Shannon, I'm just going to see if I can't queue up some additional interest after your comment. I'm particularly interested, a few of you are developers/lenders or in the lending environment who we haven't heard from yet. I'm curious if there's anything in the presentation of the analysis or the analysis itself that gets you sort of excited, or anything that you've read that's a little bit of a worry as it relates to minimum standards, rebuttable presumptions, or what's the other one? Sorry, just a safe harbor for HPS action. Sort of what are those things that you're interested in or not interested in cities pursuing? So with that, Shannon, please.
Okay, I'm going to try to be succinct and organized. There are 3 things I'd like to say. The first one, I feel like the improved market conditions wasn't really contemplated for the single family development. So the improved market conditions is when inclusionary incentives in single family developments work best. So I would just request that that kind of thinking be uniformly, like if that's where 65% of the development is happening in a lot of Oregon communities, let's take some of that improved market conditions thinking there as well. And when I think of that, I also want to emphasize that it was like, but those homes don't say affordable. Like they do if they're ground lease homes, and we can do, and we do dispersed site ground lease homes. When I say we, I mean Proud Ground, Rooted Homes, Habitat for Humanity, Deb Northwest. That we are literally growing this field of practitioners with this expertise in our state. So an idea, right, is that what about density bonuses or variance bonuses for single family developers who commit to including a certain number of permanently affordable homes that 80% AMI or lower, or homes with 1,000 square feet or lower? Like why do we like let go of these 0-step entry cottages that could be 3 small units detached on a lot on a corner in a higher income development? So I just ask to uniformly, right, apply our optimistic thinking, if we're going to apply it anywhere, to apply it to single family too. That was one comment. There's another comment that I want to make from my own, I'm reading certain data, maybe you're reading some different data, and I do love this report, like agreed. This is a great starting place for this conversation and a lot of hard work, and thank you. But on page 26, there's this bolded statement, maintaining home ownership can be challenging for low-income households. Maintaining home ownership could be challenging for middle-income households and higher-income households who live paycheck to paycheck and have no savings. I just feel like there's potentially a lot of bias wrapped up in that statement without cited, like, what's the source for that? Do we think that? Do we know that? Because I can point to some data, right, that shows that especially home buyers who are lower income, moderate income, who belong to what we might call communities of color, racially and ethnically diverse first-time home buyers are actually more successful in retaining their home than higher income white people. So that's a data-driven fact I can share. I'm concerned that there was some unintentional disparity in that statement that's not aligning with our values. And I also saw there was this like, but we don't know how many lower income people or people of color like want to be homeowners. I think Brock does. I'm pretty sure the Oregon Realtors Association literally did that survey for our state 2 years ago. So if you'd like that data, it's available. I got fired up. This topic is close to my heart. And I can also tell you our Habitat homeowners, like some of it is like, was the mortgage equitable, which is a whole different story. Most of our home buyers in the Portland region, 8 out of 10 identify as lower income community of color. Our average AMI statewide is 46%, and our mortgage payoff rate exceeds 98%. So I want to put that out there, right? And then back to the whole document itself, I also want to say, I see that Eco Northwest, from what I read, was given the brief, right, from DLCD to say what zoning actions should be here. And when we are talking about single family, I just went back and looked at the housing productions worksheet because I'm like, where is this listed? Like, what is this? It's under financial incentives, SDCs. And if we're talking about what pencils for-profit builders and what we're trying to incentivize, and we're talking about zoning, I feel like it's actually disingenuous at the end of the day to put SDCs under financial incentives. SDCs are so regressive, right? Part of why these homes are so big is because your SDC and your permits are cheaper per square foot. Like, they are cheaper per square foot. If I build a 5,000 square foot home and an 800 square foot home, and I have to pay the same SDC, which one is more expensive per square foot? So if we zone and allow, right, middle density housing, but a triplex with 3 800 square foot homes, your SDCs are 3 times as much as one 5,000 square foot home. What are for-profit builders going to be able to finance better? The 5,000 square foot home, right? Like, those SDCs need to get expensive for that 5,000 square foot home, and they need to get cheap for that triplex. Like, create a realistic SDC scale that starts to force the market into the protection that we want and need. Same with permits, I would argue. So it just feels painful for me to see, like, this is land use. These are financial incentives over here. They're actually financial disincentives to doing what we want today. So that's my soapbox. Calm down. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate the passion you bring to this and pointing out some of the idiosyncrasies and potentially flaws in some of the thinking that we've had so far. So thank you for that. Julia.
Yeah. I wanted to also echo the notes of just thanks and awe of this document. I had wished I had had more time to dig into some of the appendix pieces too, because there's a lot of really good stuff in here. And I meant to lay that caveat early on because I'm sure a lot of my comments and questions are probably buried in the appendix somewhere, because I'm sure you guys thought about a lot of things that you couldn't put into the summary. So with the question around things that I'm kind of excited about and would like to see kind of explored or furthered, I also really like the inclusion of minimum requirements. This is something that our coalition of partners has been asking for since about a year ago, I think, for exactly the reasons you laid out in terms of just making sure every city is doing something in terms of the stuff that we know are problematic and like every city has an issue related to it. It kind of helps fill potential holes that might exist in the analyses that are done in the CHM process, not due to lack of skill by consultants such as yourself, but just because of the reality of that we know that a lot of folks with high needs are usually underrepresented in the data that we can access. So I really like the minimum requirements. I like that it's conceptually kind of a pick'em list. I've been a big fan of the pick'em lists for a very long time as well, across all of the things, because again, I think the number one thing I keep hearing from cities is a desire for a combination of clarity in terms of expectations and flexibility to meet those. And so I think that these menus where we're saying this is the list that we consider to be a very good direction for you, and you can kind of plug and play, choose your own adventure off that list is fantastic. And I also like the concept of like maybe layering that with like a minimum requirement, rebuttable presumption, as Brock put it, so that if a city has an idea that is equally fantastic or maybe even better, so we can prompt some creativity in that, that's also really great. With that, I will pivot into then my critique of the safe harbor structure being that it's one option. And I think that's pretty limiting. And I worry that that would limit how many cities would utilize that, which then do we even bother? And so I kind of really liked the direction we were going in previous iterations where we had a menu option of rebuttable presumptions as well. And again, just kind of going back to I think that even if a city doesn't go down the direct path of whatever is on that rebuttable presumption, it provides this North Star of like, oh, this is what the city is saying I should do. And like, there's flexibility in how I can get there or I can just do what the city says to do. And I think that that's great. So yeah, kind of hoping that there's a way to layer back in options across all these categories in the long run, because I just think that will increase usability, will increase that flexibility piece, and hopefully increase success, because I still have faith that our city planners know their communities best. And so them getting to pick off a list, I think, allows them to do their job while the state is also doing their job by giving them, kind of direction and guardrails, so to speak.
Thanks, Julia. And with that, I definitely want to invite the city staff, or sorry, jurisdictional staff, including Clackamas County, Karen, Ariel, Anne, I see your hand up, but Brianne, if those of you have additional ideas or thoughts on how this flexibility and how these compliance pathways may work or not work for you, we'd really like to hear that as well. Mac.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm going to try to keep this brief, but I want to quickly plus one what Shannon was saying and plus one what Julia was just saying. Again, really liking, in particular, really liking and I'm a big fan of that pick'em list for allowing for that flexibility to match local conditions, as well as within that menu that we have yet to see. I know we've talked about this a little in the past, and we've been focusing a lot here, of course, on land use, but I hope it also addresses some items related to permitting, as that is the other major big touch point that any housing development has with the jurisdiction outside of the land use process. So just a little plug for there. Within the safe harbors that are mentioned within the reports, I appreciate the intent. Particularly, I'm looking at on page 30 in the multi-unit housing and then the affordable and mixed income housing in larger cities, that 100% of land within a high opportunity area with residential zones subject to middle housing requirements, excluding parcels developed with existing multi-unit or middle housing in areas at elevated risk of displacement. I appreciate that note about existing multi-unit or middle housing in particular. I think it's an undue burden of jurisdictions to concentrate their high density zoning on multifamily parcels that are already developed. we should expand access for where more multi-unit development can happen. I think Michael has flagged in the past that in Clackamas County, like the densest housing availability already has a bunch of apartment buildings on it. So I'm very doubtful that's going to get redeveloped at an even higher level. The part of this that I appreciate the intent, but I'm wondering if it's maybe going a little too far, is about the areas at risk of elevated risk of displacement. I just want to make sure that we're not closing off the opportunity for nonprofit, LIHTC, again, larger projects, which is that 40 units, to be able to have to be developed in those areas that are at risk of displacement. I know Commissioner Lazo has commented on this in the past, but we do want to open up areas of high opportunity to more housing development that is critical for expanding opportunity and addressing segregation. But we also want to make sure that development and stabilizing affordable housing is still possible in those low opportunity, lower income, and areas of high risk of displacement sort of communities. I don't have an answer there. It's a really tricky question and policy point to try to land on. And so I want to acknowledge that it's not super easy. If it was, we would just do it. But just want to express that little bit of concern of making sure that, yeah, we can still get larger scale affordable housing in those communities. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mac. Yes, we have talked about as a group in the past that sort of need to do both. Think about how to get more housing and more housing choice in high opportunity areas, and also reinvest in areas that have some better choices. Yep. Anne.
Thank you. I really appreciate the document. I love research and data, and also everyone's comments have been spot on. So I feel like I haven't had to chime in at all because everybody said great stuff. I did want to note support for minimum rebuttable presumption. I like that idea as a city. I really appreciated what Julia said and Shannon about some of the housing types that can be affordable. And, you know, when you look at the recommendations and then you look back at I know it's a very draft model code, you know, Shannon flagged the concern about the 3 stories. Well, even though it's not required, there's still this minimum floor area ratio that doesn't quite fit in the neighborhood scale that we really need to be careful about. So it actually forces you to do 2 or 4 stories in the, you know, 10,000 or less, or 10 to 50,000 size cities, or size lots, sorry, for large cities, and Albany's large city. We've got a tiny home village that is probably 25 units an acre, and it's all 1 story and, you know, or 1 to 2 stories. So I just want to make sure that when we tie it back to the specifics. And then I did want to really echo several people's comments about beyond zoning, the other tools the city has in its toolbox, and like scaling SDCs to house size. We've done that. Now we're looking at maybe going back to the actual square footage and not just ranges of square footages, but we also scale lot size to house size. But those non-zoning, well, the lot size is zoning, but the SDC, that's what we hear the most from people and their impact. That and I know we've got that menu, but some of these need to go hand in hand, and that we're still able to choose some of these options. And I mean, these are general recommendations for the, I guess, safe harbor, but different kinds of, you know, either the neighborhood multifamily versus a corridor multifamily, multi-dwelling unit development. I mean, our zones would allow all of the neighborhood and the multi-dwelling unit zones, and then some of the zones would allow the corridor. But I mean, just more specifics. And I know we're capturing general stuff, but it's all really good, and I appreciate all the work and comments.
Thank you. And Sean, I see you have your hand up. I'm guessing you have some insights on the model code piece.
Yeah, just a technical correction. That's not a minimum floor area ratio. That's a maximum. So the way it's calibrated, if you look at, say, for example, the large cities model code, if you look at small sites, right, the way it's calibrated in large cities is the maximum FAR allows a 3-story multi-unit building to basically take up most of the site. And then that FAR kind of scales down when you have bigger and bigger sites to kind of also allow that garden typology that you see more often in places like you see it often in places like Bend or Salem, that type of thing towards the outskirts of town. So generally the kind of intensity is lower, so the FAR is lower. That's not a minimum. So in terms of neighborhood scale, like we're talking about getting up to a maximum and not you have to build a minimum of this and then X, Y, and Z, kind of beyond that. So just a clarification on the technical.
I'm just used to seeing minimum FAR and not maximum. So I just, my brain always switches to minimum. So no, I appreciate you reminding me of that. So they're still just making sure that the code really doesn't preclude some of the housing types that are really needed and that are still providing, adequate densities.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's where like the specifics of the zone are distinct from the specifics that apply to multi-unit in particular, right? So the code absolutely allows smaller scale multi-unit development. So just wanted to clarify that point.
Great. Thanks for bringing up Anne, and thank you for clarifying that, Sean. Ethan, do you have additional clarification or items you want to address?
I do, yeah. Thanks, Deb. Just real quick. So I think it started actually with a question from Mary Kyle earlier, and then heard it a couple of times throughout here. I just want to be real clear that the obligation for local governments in a housing production strategy is to be responsive to the entirety of the contextualized housing need. These compliance pathways identify some ways in which local governments could meet those obligations. If those safe harbors or other things in these compliance pathways do not meet the rest of the contextualized housing need, their obligation is to take other actions to supplement. So things like SDC waivers or reconfiguring SDC methodologies or bringing in other resources and incentives, so on and so forth, that are outside of the land use sphere. So I just wanted to share that because I think I've been hearing some conversation around that piece.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes, this is not just land use and zoning action cities must take unless that's the only thing they need to do to address their need, which I'd be shocked by. Brock, I'm going to go to Garland and Gust first. Thank you. Go ahead, Garland. And Garland, could you introduce yourself since you missed introductions? Thank you.
Sure. Hello, I'm Garland Woodsong. I'm the president and chair of the Oregon Cooperative Housing Network, and also the executive director of Place Initiative. I just wanted to chime in because I'm looking at the Eco Northwest memo, pages 30 to 32. Just following up on an earlier comment about this, where it's talking about affordable and mixed income housing, also multi-unit housing, and it's laying out these requirements for large and metro cities, but then it sort of throws up its hands, almost as if like the team didn't know what to do in areas with elevated risk of displacement. And so they thought maybe like the best thing to do would just be to not require these things in those areas. But I don't think that represents a best practice. I think that represents like kind of ignorance. Like, hey, this is really scary. We don't want to cause more displacement. We don't know what to do to not cause displacement. So let's just like not touch those areas. And I don't think that's the right approach. I don't think the approach to areas at risk of displacement is to lock them in amber and lock them out of the opportunity of high housing types. I was recently at a convening in South Berkeley, California, the Black neighborhood that's been, subject to racial discrimination, including the invention of zoning in Berkeley 100 years ago. And they were in conversations around Berkeley's new middle housing ordinance and really struggling. A large percentage of the Black community just kind of didn't want the middle housing ordinance imposed on them. And so I was talking with them, trying to unpack, like, well, is that really the right answer? Do you really want to be locked out of the opportunity? And they're engaging in a lot of community land trust and housing cooperative development there. And kind of where we came up with as kind of a more aligned proposal would be to lock out market rate development of higher density housing types in those neighborhoods, because that's what causes displacement. So to allow higher density housing type development, if it's going to be owned by a CLT, including a housing cooperative that sits on a CLT, then you could unlock those higher density levels, but not the market rate development that's really going to do nothing for the existing community, except for maybe pad one seller's wallet if they sell out and leave. And so I would like to offer that up, that we need to be intelligent about how we treat areas that are at risk of displacement And locking them in amber is not the solution. It's kind of like a reaction based in fear and ignorance. We need to have tools that actually embrace these communities and give them pathways to opportunity, pathways to increase ownership, pathways for the next generation to buy in and gain ownership in the communities. The community land trust model, when paired with housing cooperatives for multi-unit buildings, is the path forward. Let's not pretend it doesn't exist. It exists. We need to lock it into code, though, in city code, so that these opportunity zones have a pathway to intensify and improve over time and increase access to ownership pathways. Thank you.
Thanks, Garland. Becky, clarification?
Yeah, just a quick clarification that I guess the intention was not that the areas at risk of displacement should be avoided for affordable housing, but not the context we're in is the state articulating a kind of one size fits all set of standards, and that areas at risk of displacement might not be appropriate places for a one size fits all state established standard. I do take Mac's point earlier as well that it is important to be able to put affordable housing investments into those areas. I think making sure the message to local governments is clear that that is not like the place to put all your affordable housing in lieu of putting it other places, right? Like that. So I think that finding that balance of how to encourage, ensure that there are viable opportunities for affordable housing investments in those areas, but I'm not sure that a compliance pathway that sets specific standards is something certainly that DLCD can weigh in their actual rule writing, but the concern was based on having kind of a one size fits all approach as opposed to an opportunity, having it emerge through a conversation with the community, which is more the method that Garland is describing is a set of standards that is kind of co-created with the community in that area and with the affordable housing developers that work in that area. So that's the reason why that specific tool was not recommended for use in those areas. And certainly, as we said, there are trade-offs with all of these choices, and that doesn't have to be the way that things land.
Yep.
I could just respond quickly.
Yep, quick.
Just I don't think the capital A affordable housing is actually a good solution for these communities either, because it's not providing a pathway to ownership. It's just continuing to extract rent, but to a mission-driven developer and owner rather than a profit-seeking developer and owner. The solution for these communities really does need to be pathways to ownership, and you can only get that in a multifamily setting through community land trusts and co-ops. These capital A affordable housing does not provide pathways to ownership and wealth building.
All right, thanks for that perspective. I'm going to take these last three hands and we're just about out of time. I might just borrow a couple more minutes because I want to make sure we're also getting at that last question in this section about how local governments can be held accountable. I know Michael mentioned that a little bit before, but I don't want to give that the short shrift it's getting here. Sorry. Gust, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just keep it real brief. I agree with Anne in that there's just a lot of good things being said that I can just associate with. So reiterating that isn't necessarily important. But I feel like, and what you just mentioned about the accountability for cities, I think that's one of the important things that I'm an advocate for. I noticed Shannon mentioned getting on a soapbox, and I feel like I can do that too at times, primarily through the small community and very rural residential lens. But the gravity of that to me is that if you don't operate in those areas and those communities, there's a lot of intangibles that go along with that. And so I think it's important to really put some hard boundaries on just being a human being. And we have human beings running our cities, right? And in rural communities, I feel like it's different. And that's the only place that I work and operate. And by looking at the board here, I suspect that the majority of you all work and operate in larger cities. And there's just differences. I think Shannon has worked with me a little bit on some things, and can appreciate some of the idiosyncrasies there. But I really feel like, I guess the point I wanted to make is just giving parameters to the accountability that cities have to do. And I know a lot of city staff don't necessarily like that concept because it's, it is kind of restrictive. But I think it's also important to have them be accountable to some of the intentional outreach that they do, or the intentional improvements that they're trying to make. So thanks again for all the hard work.
Thanks, Gus. Really always appreciate your perspective on these things. Brock.
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick. Just want to make 2 quick points. One, I want to draw a very clear differentiation between the types of minimum standards that we have seen suggested and drafted to date versus what we're seeing in this report. And the previous versions have been pick one of these 3 in the rule. This version is you have a whole list of options that you can choose from, and if one of those doesn't fit, then you can, show something else that's going to. In terms of the way that the rule is written, that can come across as a pretty minimal difference in language, but it is a huge difference in impact. If you have, upzone, implement minimum densities, right, or raise minimum densities, and like one other thing, right, you are forcing a choice between those 3. And even if you have something else, it's just like, try, if none of these work, try something else. The fact that those 3 in particular, whatever they are suggested in rule makes it much more likely that cities are going to go to that because they see it as being recommended. They see it as something that's going to provide them political cover when they go to city council and they have to defend against NIMBYs and different things like that, right? Allowing that flexibility, requiring to take action, but allowing flexibility on how that works based on local context is really important. And so I do want to draw a very clear line of differentiation between pick one of these from this rule versus, pick a strategy that is going to help here. The only other thing I would say here right now, there are several comments about how, upzoning is a housing production strategy. And yes, that is true. But I want to make very clear, and I think this report did a great job of emphasizing it as well, that if upzoning puts you above the capacity of what your market can feasibly produce, it is not a housing production strategy, it is a housing prevention strategy. And so that calibration needs to be very careful when we're doing this. It is great to use land more efficiently when we're able to do it, but there is a threshold. And it's not the same in every city because it depends on who your builders are, what their expertise is, depends on, the favorable or less favorable financing options they can get, right? But there is a very clear threshold there. I'll leave that for now so we can get to the next students.
Great. Thank you, Brock. Shannon.
Just super quickly, just a couple thoughts regarding areas at risk of displacement. I really think back to my colleague who leads Habitat for Humanity in Charlottesville, Virginia, who I think of as our network's resident expert on this topic, who's done so much community engagement in some really vulnerable neighborhoods, and really just, he's one of the humblest people I know. He's one of the best listeners I know. And some of their findings that they recently shared with the Urban Land Institute was about maximizing wealth building opportunities for current residents. So like in those neighborhoods, making it as easy as it can be to build an ADU, or even to have a business sited adjacent to your home. Like lowering those barriers actively so that current residents can build wealth was one really great strategy. And interestingly, what they've actually done in Charlottesville, which I think is brilliant to my mind, they've heightened density in higher income single detached neighborhoods, but they've lowered eligible density in neighborhoods at risk of displacement. And to get to the maximum allowable density, you have to have at least 1 of 3 units be affordable. So you can't like wage out the current community who lives in that neighborhood. And then concomitantly, like again, I just got to go to our Habitat ED Summit and got to tour a revitalized area of Long Beach with a lot of resident-led organizing and having grants for community-based organizations. Just like was being said, Becky, I think by you so beautifully, actually resident-led organizations getting to choose strategic investments. Like, it just blew my mind to think that like lighting, they were having alley lighting parties, right? Like how cheap is it to light an alley, right? But for like a sense of safety and belonging, that like it's a party to light up some alleys. That was just, and I know, you know, Long Beach doesn't necessarily translate to certain communities in Oregon, but that concept of like, I would have never thought of that. Like I just wouldn't have known. So that power of like an actual resident community-based organization. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks for ending with some good ideas about how things could be dialed in further, but also that role of the conversations with communities in need of housing and or in need of stability in their housing. With that, I'm gonna take 5-minute break because I know we all could use a stretch of the legs, and then we'll come back and tackle the contextualized housing need. Eka will give us a short presentation leading into that, but we'll try to reserve as much time as possible for the discussion. So back at 11:07, type 5. Thank you. All righty. Thank you all for the quick break. I'm going to move us along because we're not long on time here. Echo's going to give, again, a little bit of an overview, high points of their analysis related to the contextualized housing need assumptions, and then we'll get to discussion. So with that, I think Becky, you're on point here. Take it away.
All right, we got screen back. Perfect. All right, so pivoting to talking about the contextualized housing need upstream of the HPS, but a little different set of questions here. So we were asked to look at whether the state could potentially develop quantitative assumptions to go into compliance pathways for the contextualized housing need, to take a look at the data that is available to see how robust it is, and to think about the potential for unintended consequences of setting a specific number as a compliance pathway. We were specifically asked to look at unit type mix, accessible units, location, and specifically within that opportunity areas, affordable homeownership, and unit size, particularly family size units. So those are the topics that that we got into. So first up, unit type mix. The data there, I will say, I hope that the data will be better in the future when jurisdictions have gotten further along with the permitted and produced reports, and those are more consistently available. And right now, what we have best available statewide is data from HUD with an acronym that I can never pronounce correctly, but it's written here. And so that's the best available we have across the state. It is not great for small cities. But what we see in looking at that, and the primary differentiation that we were looking at was single unit versus multi-unit. There is an important caveat on single unit, which is that in that permit data, it includes attached and detached. So townhouses are an unknown share of the yellow part of the bar. And the multi-unit is everything else, basically. So what we saw in looking at that data was that there are some patterns about how this is looking back over the last, I think, 5 years of that permit data, that there is some differentiation by both city size and region. When we kind of thought about which of those was the potentially more reliable, I think the difference in the prevalence of larger cities by region is maybe a lot of the story of what's going on at the regional level. And we also, within the 3-county metro region, when we differentiate Portland from everybody else, you see a real difference between City of Portland and the rest of the metro UGB. So that's a sort of a look back, an imperfect look back at where we have been on unit type mix. The other thing that we saw in the data is that it's very clear that there's a relationship between housing type and affordability. That's not to say, and to a point that Shannon made earlier, that's not to say that single unit detached housing can never, ever be made affordable. That's certainly not the point that we're trying to make here. However, when we look at the affordable housing that has been funded statewide, the vast majority of it is in the form of multi-unit housing, and other folks on this in this group have spoken to reasons for that in the past, and we'll get into it. I think y'all are pretty familiar with how we fund affordable housing and how that shows up in terms of the built form. But that is, so it's not only multi-unit, but it is mostly multi-unit. And then when we look at market rate housing, the for sale and single unit detached is generally less affordable than new multi unit rental housing and manufactured housing. So when the market is producing for sale housing, which is mostly single unit detached, most of that is coming in above the 120% of AMI level, a smaller share affordable at that more middle income level, whereas the new multi-unit housing market rate is mostly hitting at that kind of middle income level of affordability and some above and below. There are differences by city size and region, but the data is not really at a level where we think those are super strong differences that we would peg policy to. In terms of other policy considerations of, pros and cons for having a quantified type mix at all, or how you might structure it. You all know this, but this is a really important assumption that goes into the housing capacity analysis. And because housing capacity analysis can become the basis for a UGB expansion, and UGB expansions are more likely to be subject to legal scrutiny than many of the other things that other parts of the Goal 10 process. Having some legal certainty for jurisdictions, especially in smaller cities that might not have a lot of bandwidth to do really rigorous analysis on this, it's valuable to cities that might end up in a situation of doing a UGB expansion. Some other factors, though, if the housing mix were pushed really far towards multi-unit and middle housing, there's the potential for us, if we're saying that's what the need is, that we would be kind of so out of line with what the market plus the affordable housing developers and the affordable housing resources that we have and that we can create over that time period. If we are so far away from what is achievable, that could affect how our land sufficiency calculations work. We are assuming that what we really need is lots more multi-unit, and we are only looking at land sufficiency for that. Multi-unit is at a much higher density than single unit housing. We could easily end up in a situation where we do not actually have enough land for housing and for single unit housing because we didn't think we needed that much of it, but it turns out that's what got built. So that's a potential challenge of pushing things too far, or if cities were to say, what I really need is to have lots and lots of land that is zoned only for multi-unit housing, not to allow a mix of housing types. Again, you could end up restricting the opportunities for things that the market can actually deliver. So that's not to say we can't push the mix at all, but again, there's an upper limit on how far you might want to push before you get into some of these unintended consequences. And then as we think about jurisdictions across a region, their starting point can be pretty different of what they've been building recently. So if you were to set just one mix, and then a jurisdiction that maybe has been doing more multi-unit and middle housing than what that mix is now they've got sort of perverse political pressure to drop down to that mix, because it's well, why would we want to go further? So that variation in the data within a region could mean that, if you just use one number, it could play out differently for different jurisdictions. And then just wanted to flag that there is a precedent of a kind of minimum approach in the form of the Metropolitan Housing Rule, already applies in metro UGB cities, and depending on where things land with rulemaking, may need an update for consistency, but it kind of provides a precedent for how we think about requirements related to type mix. So this is another one that our team had multiple conversations about and continue to have maybe some range of perspectives within our team about what would be the best solution. The thing we're offering up here as a way to navigate those many trade-offs is a rebuttable presumption to plan for a housing type mix that is the larger of these two things, either a minimum that's set at based on city size and region, or what they have permitted and produced, and they can't go backwards relative to what they've permitted and produced over the last HPS period. So even if these numbers are below what they've been doing, they can't drop relative to what they've been doing. These numbers are based on the imperfect data that we have available. They generally take the numbers that were in that chart and move them up by roughly 5 percentage points, rounding up. And they combine multi-unit and middle housing, just to not be sort of overly prescriptive of the specific differences between those. I will note that both that bucket would also include SROs and manufactured housing in the way we're thinking about this. So it basically ends up being sort of a cap on how much single unit detached housing you can assume in your needed housing type mix. And it's intended to be kind of representing sort of a straight face test. Like you would, if your need were below this number, we would need to see some justification for it, but not pushing that number really, really high beyond what is plausibly achievable. So that's the kind of balance that we have put forward as one of many possible ways to thread this needle. I'm going to keep going through the other topics. And I guess if folks have like clarifying questions, I don't know, Deb, if you want them to just write them down or drop them in the chat to you or something. And hopefully people don't lose their clarifying questions as we go.
I think we got to keep it moving. And if it's even possible to like really hit the high points, we're assuming we've read the memo. So thank you.
Okay. On accessible units, we looked both at what we see in the data about need and what we can guess about supply on the need side. And folks have talked about this. There is higher prevalence among older people, lower income households in medium cities and outside the metro region. This is specifically focused on ambulatory disabilities. There might be other features needed for other types of disabilities. And a point we wanted to make that hasn't necessarily been part of previous conversations is that the research we have seen is that seniors generally prefer to age in place. And so thinking about the housing that meets their needs is maybe a little bit different if we're talking about them wanting to stay in their existing housing. There is no data reliably on availability of accessible and adaptable units. So we took the data that we had and gave it a best guess based on what we know. Takeaway within specifically multi-unit housing, there's a decent number of the adaptable type B units and about the minimum required number of type A. I mean, we're just guessing, but people will not have provided more than what they needed to do in general, especially within market rate housing. But this doesn't include senior specific housing, and we didn't make any different assumptions about affordable housing, which may have, been meeting specific population needs. So this is a rough guess, but based on that, we think that the key deficits are probably single unit detached and middle housing that can be adaptable over time as people age in place. The need for, this gets at that intersectionality point that was raised earlier, the need for housing that is both accessible and affordable. Units that are not just sort of minimally adaptable, but truly designed to meet the needs of those with wheelchairs. Housing that meets the needs of folks with different types of disabilities, sensory disabilities, and things that are generally not covered by the code requirements we have today. Because multi-unit housing is less prevalent in smaller cities and outlying regions, and so are elevators, that need is probably greater in those places. And as I mentioned, modifying our existing housing stock to support seniors that may help them more than having new market rate apartments, because that's not necessarily what's going to meet their needs. And our population is aging, so we're likely to need more of this overall. So we thought it could be helpful to have a quantitative state safe harbor just linked to the share of the population with ambulatory disabilities, maybe bumping that up a little bit based on our aging population, and to make sure that the way that that gets articulated is not just to say type A or type B units, because it really should encompass this idea of being able to retrofit units that people are already living in. And then because a lot of planners are new to planning for accessible units, we think that some guidance would go a long way to kind of summarize, what's required, how does this work, and just to sort of help people level up in their understanding of planning for and meeting accessibility needs. Location and opportunity areas. So there's kind of two pieces here. There's how do we determine what is a high opportunity area, and then there's what do we want to put in those high opportunity areas. In terms of mapping those opportunity areas, I know this group has had a little bit of information about the kind of ongoing draft mapping work, but just some highlights from the kind of data considerations there. Again, statewide data is not perfect on everything. At the same time, if local governments are doing this for themselves, there could be a lot of variation in how they approach this with the rules as they are today. And the political pressures are different in different places. And some places there might be some strong NIMBY pressure to not call my place high opportunity if you're going to then make me do stuff there. The way that the methodology is set up right now, it's just a draft, but it may not really line up with the places that are, sort of considered desirable places to live. Just the, requirements about access to transit and commercial are going to miss a lot of neighborhoods that people may find really desirable. And it's going to miss places that are planned to be complete communities in the future, but they aren't there yet. The assets are not there yet. Also, things like tsunami risk, or, there's different like assets and harms that sort of are differentially relevant depending on like how good your transit system is or whether you are on the coast. And so the current methodology hasn't fully wrestled with those issues yet. It's sort of aligned with the ORCA location preferences. There were some intentional choices to make it not like that may catch up. In any case, they're not currently perfectly squared up, which has some trade-offs with it. And there's still a lot of work to do to get them finalized. We, knowing all that, took the maps as they stand today, and we overlaid recently constructed for sale units and market rate rentals and affordable housing recently funded affordable housing development to see how they line up with the version we have right now of mapping opportunity areas. Generally, we were seeing for sale units going in areas that were considered low asset, low harm. And that gets to the thing I was saying, that like those desirable neighborhoods are not necessarily being picked up as high asset because they may not have transit and they may not have commercial. And so that's where a lot of our new detached housing is going, or new for sale housing is going. And then the market rate rentals are mostly in areas that are being identified as high asset right now, some high harm, some low harm, because of sort of where they are relative to commercial corridors. And then the affordable housing projects are actually mostly on balance ending up in the high asset areas and more high asset, low harm than not, which is great. So when we think about sort of how to navigate that, again, we think a mix of guidance and some additional requirements for how local governments approach this could maybe be a helpful balance. We think that wherever the state lands on that statewide map, it's going to be really helpful to just share it as a resource with some guidance about how you might apply this locally, considerations of how you might improve on it or you might adjust it. And then again, this is a world that a lot of local government planners do not have a lot of experience with. So providing some guidance about like available data sources and how to do the analysis, that just in a guidance way, I think could be really helpful. And then at the same time, putting some more specificity to the rules around this in terms of definitions, how you weigh assets and harms, how you address future plan development areas, how high opportunity areas relate to the recaps and other racially ethnically concentrated areas, and how you can ensure that where these high opportunity areas end up reflects and is consistent with the findings from the equitable engagement. Affordable home ownership. There is a strong correlation between home ownership and income. Not a lot of variation at the regional level necessarily. And this, Shannon had touched on this a little bit earlier, that identifying what the real need is for affordable homeownership is a kind of a policy choice as much as a data question. And it also, acknowledging the point that Shannon made about the ongoing efforts to reform the construction defect liability situation for condos, there is still a really strong relation between tenure and unit types. Sorry for the barking dog in the background. And Shannon, taking your point about maintaining homeownership is not easy for anyone. We were thinking about sort of ability to physically maintain the home as unexpected expenses crop up, and the need for savings and those sorts of issues. But your points there are well taken. So we think the existing rules kind of already get to some of this around housing tenure and wealth building opportunities as a fair housing issue area. So we think it's a viable option to just rely on the existing rules, or to maybe call out that affordable home ownership is a specific need, but not trying to put a number to it, or to offer a safe harbor that is about sort of incrementally improving home ownership, increasing home ownership among lower and moderate income households, which is not the same as this is our ideal end state, but as a safe harbor, if you were to try to say what should we be trying to do over the next 6 to 8 years, some kind of incremental improvement is just one way to think about a reasonable way to estimate those needs. I have one more, and then it'll be y'all's turn. Unit size and bedroom count. So overall, there is lots of larger family size housing. It's just mostly single detached and mostly for sale. Whereas our rental housing is much more likely to be smaller. And our renter households are smaller generally than the average, but there's maybe still some mismatch there. And then when you look at market rate, larger units, they tend to be expensive. So the real gap, and I'm going to just skip ahead, is the real gap is the combination of tenure, affordability, unit type, and bedroom size. It's not just about family size units. And we think that focusing on unit size alone could have some unintended consequences and lead to cities taking some actions that might not be productive. Again, we think this is one where you could just rely on the existing rules. You could say that family size affordable housing units are a need. You must name that as a need, but not specifically quantify it. Or you could have some sort of safe harbor that is based on the share of renter households with 3 or more members that are in that city or region. So those are just some options to consider for that one. I will unshare and open it up for Deb to facilitate discussion.
Thank you, Becky. I am well aware that we are short on time, so I'll just say up front, you are more than welcome to send written comments and thoughts. It's not the same as doing it here. And if you just note whether they're intended for the team only or for public comment, but hopefully that can relieve some pressure to get everything out right now. I just want to reiterate the questions that we're really hoping to hear from you. Your general perspectives, of course, policy trade-offs, and thoughts about the policy trade-offs that the ECHO team has identified, And most importantly, sort of with this new analysis and keeping in mind the sort of lens of the housing crisis, racial equity, et cetera, what do you think are the reasonable quantitative assumptions for contextualized housing need that the state can set for local folks to carry forward, take action against? And, balancing that certainty of compliance for not only the housing production strategy, but also the housing capacity analysis, which the contextualized housing need has to cover both, with that flexibility to plan for housing in the local context. So just, and especially looking not just to those of you who build, of course, I definitely want to hear about what assumptions you think would be helpful to make sure cities are building housing needed, but also local governments here. Really curious if there's anything in here you're seeing that would pose a problem or maybe resolve some of your capacity issues. We want to hear about all those things. So I'm going to take us right to probably about 5 minutes before we leave. So 25-ish, 20 to 25 minutes here. I'm going to start with folks we haven't heard from yet, which is Kathy and Brianne. So Kathy, please take it away. Oh, and Matt as well.
A question and and two reflections. I thought cities were assigned contextualized housing need by the state at the beginning of this whole process. So I'm curious as to why it is now being thrown back on the cities to do that. I thought we had already assessed that. So I'm curious. In terms of accessibility, I would add that one of the things we need to do is train building inspectors. It's not just builders, but the the building inspectors who need training on what is adaptable or accessible and what those requirements are and what they look like. And also it would be useful to have some materials on how to do modifications as people try to age in place. What are things they can do? The other thing I just want to point out is there has been no discussion on the 0 to 30% AMI or specifically 0 to 30% AMI and race. I know that's going to have to mainly be from housing that is provided by nonprofits, but we have to continue to think about how to facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And to maybe partially answer your question, we probably should have started there and recapped yet again. The Oregon Housing Needs Analysis does assign to cities or local jurisdictions a total number of units they need to be producing, as well as units by affordability bracket. The statute requires cities to also contextualize their housing need by looking at where to get more choice, and then the production, affordability, and choice with regard to locations, characteristics of housing, and type of housing. So they do have to sort of drill down a little bit further on the total number of units and the affordability that they're being assigned. And they do that through analysis, through being given these assumptions with rule potentially, and also through conversation with community members who need that housing in those areas. Okay, Brianne, please go ahead.
Thanks. I'll try and keep it brief, but just a huge shout out to the team. This was like a huge task to take on, and I really appreciated what was in the memo. Like multiple times I like audibly was like, yeah, or like, this is great. So thank you. There's a huge amount of work that went into this. And then I guess just kind of more general impressions with the CHNA. I tended to be in agreement with most of the recommendations in there. I thought they seemed reasonable. They seemed like a good solution. I'm just kind of at a higher level. I was happy to see the acknowledgement of kind of that nexus between the CHNA and the HCA that I feel like that's kind of been missing in a lot of our previous conversations, and really how important it is for those kind of that early recognition of how that will have this cascading effect throughout the planning work and what actually gets implemented at the end. As far as the kind of housing mix. I thought that solution seemed reasonable considering that all cities are starting kind of at different points. It's still somewhat progressive in looking at our own numbers at least. And still not even progressive, but still it's still aspirational, I guess I should say, looking at our own numbers, but it doesn't seem so far out that it may have unintended consequences. So I'd have to give it a little bit more thought, but that was at least my initial impression. And I appreciated the thought that went into the opportunity areas and that mapping exercise and kind of some of the conclusions that were drawn there, in allowing for it to still continue to be contextualized. Because again, that was one of the things that I struggled with in this, is that by trying to be overly prescriptive, you're no longer being contextualized to individual cities. And so I appreciated much of what I saw in there. It seemed like there was still some effort to at least allow a city to be contextualized, even if it's kind of a rebuttable presumption type of approach. But those were just my initial impressions. So thank you, team.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for weighing in. Matt.
Yeah, so I had a couple questions and I think a couple comments too. I think, the first question that I have is, I was curious, when it talks about medium and small jurisdictions, the 2% of multi-unit buildings, like 2% of the multi-unit housing being type A comes as somewhat of a surprise to me. And I'm wondering how that, what are sort of the assumptions that led to arriving at that percentage? Because I can't imagine that there are many 20 plus unit larger apartment complexes, particularly in small cities. So I can't imagine there really being 2% of type A units, basically. So that's just one question. And then I think the other question that I have has to do more with pertaining to the accessibility recommendations for contextualized housing need. It's generally framed as safe harbors or guidance. And I'm trying to recall, because I know that we've had this discussion a little bit before in terms of safe harbors and guidance here, or, rebuttable presumptions there. And I'm not sure if we landed on just using safe harbors and guidance for contextual housing need. But I would suggest or recommend that we consider making some of these ideas around accessible housing more like rebuttable presumptions. An example of that would be where it talks about, using the percentage of the population that have ambulatory issues as the baseline for the need. That's described more as like a safe harbor. And to me, that seems like it might be a good idea to make that more like a rebuttable presumption, that you presume that the need is related to the percentage of people with ambulatory issues. I mentioned that because jurisdictions might really vary in terms of how they decide how they're going to measure that accessibility need. Maybe they're going to decide that it's only wheelchair users and not people who have general mobility issues. If you did that, it might only be 1 to 2% instead of more like the 6 to 7%. And you might really not get at the need, particularly the future need. I really like how they recommend a percentage that's additive, like adding a little bit based on aging trends. That's a really, really good idea. And I also appreciated both the discussion about retrofitting and adding accessible units, because retrofitting is really going to be a way to get there with smaller and medium cities. And I'm almost done. So I think the other, area that I thought about where it talks about guidance, it talks about guidance in terms of guiding cities in collecting data on accessibility features for new and existing housing. And I'm wondering if there shouldn't be some type of minimum requirement with a more clearly spelled out methodology for actually gathering and collecting that data. Guidance suggests that cities may or may not pursue this idea of collecting accessibility data. Yet at the same time, we also say we don't have reliable data. Therefore, we can't create concrete requirements. And it's that data, it's sort of that data hole that leads us to essentially lower standards in terms of how we're going to plan these things. So I would suggest or recommend that we consider making like some of the collecting data as close to a requirement as we can.
Thank you very much, Matt. Really appreciate all of those ideas and support for some of the information. There was a question at the beginning regarding the 2% assumption type A for medium and small cities. I don't know, Becky, Lorelei, or Ian, if any of you have any feedback or thoughts on that one.
And actually, just since they're about to respond to that, maybe something else I wanted to add is there's also not really data there that it says it's only for multi-unit housing that they were able to analyze data, and that's true and fair. But I think it might be good to include somewhere like, and maybe it's reflected somewhere, but what proportion is actually multi-unit housing versus single family or duplex or detached, because that would really give you a clearer picture of like how small the amount of accessible housing actually is in these areas.
Yes, and that's a great point, Matt. The 2%, I was surprised a little bit as well. I would say, so we're working with CoStar data. CoStar misses smaller developments just generally, so it may overestimate the percentage of units because the smaller developments that are like 4 units, 5 units are less likely to be picked up at all. And the smaller cities have less data coverage in general. So the biggest gap in the data is the thing that would not have those type A units. It's the smaller units in those small and medium cities. So 2% may be optimistic within that multi-unit stock. And you are right, that multi-unit stock, especially new, is as some of our other data shows, is a smaller share of new housing production in those smaller communities. So it's 2% of a smaller number as opposed to 2% of a larger number in larger communities.
Great. Thank you, Becky. Brock.
Thank you. I'll try to go quick. So housing type mix, rebuttable presumption, I'm going to say neutral plus or support minus on that. A little bit of refinement, but I'll cover that in written comment. Characteristic on unit size, no compliance pathway, good there. Location being for high opportunity areas being a local determination with maybe some rule refinement and guidance, good there. Accessibility, noting all the things that Matt just pointed out, good there. The characteristic homeownership is the one that I want to spend most of the time on here. And I absolutely see, how there can be kind of a couple different ways, and one of those being potentially just identifying it as a need in the CHN, right? We do have a new target that was established by House Bill 2698 this year. Thank you, Shannon, for working with me on that. The one thing that I want to note in the safe harbor proposal, which is what we would support here, the kind of maybe off the cuff recommendation was a 5 to 10% increase. And I told Aurora and Alexis that I was going to say this morning, and that that advocating for the safe harbor is something that everyone was going to expect me to say. The thing that no one here is probably going to expect me to say is that I think that's too high. The way we did this in the bill was reflective of essentially a 1/3 of a percentage increase per year over the next 20 years. If you look at national research that's come out about things that actually move the dial on changing the rate of home ownership, it is really hard to do. And I think if we overassume there, one, we're going to feel like we're falling short of our goal and maybe not feel so incentivized just to continue pursuing it later on. But two, it could also put us in a position where we are taking actions with far broader reaching unintended consequences than we might otherwise accept. So my recommendation here would be a safe harbor of 1/3 of a percent per year of your HPS cycle. I have a couple rule draft language options that I will send over to the team for that. But it would come out to, I think, a little under 2% for cities with a 6-year cycle, and a little over 2.5% for those with an 8-year cycle. but I did just want to throw that out and just make sure that like we know that yes, we support the safe harbor but we want to make sure that that threshold is realistically reasonable, because I think even that 1/3% per year is aspirational. And I think if we push too far on that too fast, we're going to run into some problems that we might not expect. So fully in support of having that safe harbor, but just want to make sure the thresholds there are right.
Thank you for that, Brock. Appreciate that perspective and idea for maybe something that gets the unintended consequences down a little bit. Shannon.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to speak again to existing data just a little bit. So since I started with Habitat in 2012, I didn't have time to go back and suss everything. I did back of napkin calculations. I had a group of 5 years here or there, but our network has built and sold just right around 1,200 homes since 2012. That would not be in any OHCS data because we had no OHCS financial support for any of those homes. Doesn't mean they don't exist. People live in them, okay? But they're not going to be in the OHCS data. So happy to volunteer that data set, connect you with our national data team who's better than ever. And on top of that, we've acquired, rehabbed, and sold at least another 46 homes that were market rate that we brought down to affordable. I do want to just harp for a second on this idea of affordability and risk. So long as a mortgage is conforming and appropriate. What we have seen, because you start saving monthly, if you have down payment assistance, for example, monthly your home ownership costs are less than rental costs once you get to buy a home. And then that difference between costs gets bigger over the years, right? So that actually, even the many community members who are on SNAP at the time they become Habitat homeowners, within 5 years are off SNAP. Like we see households do financially better over time, that they have more residual income monthly over time, with only one exception. If your income is subsidized by DHS right now, you are probably going to need some help from your Habitat friends with home repairs in about 15 years. It's a small portion of the home buyers that we've served. Everybody else, they're doing okay. They're having a good life. So that's what we've seen. And regarding repairs, we do those too. We're set up to do about 1,500 over the current 5-year period. We're on track for that. We are often retrofitting homes to be accessible, including things like 0-step bathrooms, roll-in showers, ramps, guardrails. We do a lot of that work. There's a robust group of Oregon practitioners across the state. I'm thinking of like Faraday and so many great practitioners in the city of Portland and the metro area. Like there's a cadre of us out there. Since we're having this conversation, I just wanted to point that out. And I also wanted to say, aligning with this data here, our network and yay, our Oregon Health Authority Healthy Homes dollars allow this too. We do a lot of repairs in manufactured home parks with seniors. And people with limited mobility as well. So it can be in manufactured home parks, some of that sort of naturally occurring affordable home ownership, as well as more stick-built and conventionally thought of home ownership. Thanks.
Thanks, Shannon. Always nice to hear the reminders too about the full service of supports that are out there for homeowners. Mac.
Yeah, thank you. I will also try to keep this quick. I wanted to stay within this portion of the memo, which one, again, a great appreciation for all this material. It's a lot of work that you all put into it, and it's really great to get to sit here and digest. And so thank you for that privilege. I appreciated in particular report that collab between housing type and affordability. Again, it's not 100% the case, but that most single family homes without a form of public subsidy, whether direct or indirect, will not be affordable to lower income households. Again, not 100% the case, but more often than not, at least. And so seeing that as the need for helping bolster the case for why we need that denser housing to help service folks at lower affordability levels, particularly at that 60% AMI or below. And also that cross correlation between income and race, which Julia called out towards the beginning of this meeting. When it came to the unit size in terms of bedrooms, I really appreciated the recommendation of that there should not be any sort of regulations or anything like that mandating unit size within developments. That's incredibly hard. If there's ever a desire for that, I think that should be done exclusively through incentives, not requirements. And so just wanted to call that out specifically there. And then also within the unit mix for the multifamily rebuttable presumption, I liked it, but just want to make sure that there is also some guidance to jurisdictions that larger scale multifamily housing, such that it reaches the level that a light tech development could be feasible in those areas, that those not be exclusively relegated to major arterials and corridors. I say that just because of the environmental justice consideration there, of not just like air pollution from internal combustion engines. Of course, as we move to cleaner sources of fuel for cars, there's still noise pollution concerns, increasing data about the impact of microplastics from tires that like degrade on the road surfaces. And so just making sure that we open those opportunities for folks that are in low income housing in that larger multifamily developments are able to access those quieter neighborhood streets. So not just on that corridor, but being able to live at least a couple of streets off, if not even further, just to be able to access some of those benefits that come with a quieter street. I don't think that we should really be predetermining, oh, because you're a low-income resident and you live in affordable housing, that means you must be on a corridor. I don't think that's a reality that we have to face or prescribe in this state, and some guidance to jurisdictions to allow for increased options there will be really important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mac. And thank you for additional ideas about how to support more guidance for cities in making these decisions. Last call for any comments on reasonable quantitative contextualized housing need assumptions. Brock, go ahead.
Just really quick, and I mentioned this in the written comments as well, but I like the 5% above where cities have been within their last HPS cycle and not going down from there. While I agree with like Brianne, who commented that the thresholds seem fairly reasonable, I just want to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where like there are some cities potentially, I'll have to go through the data and make sure in the appendices, where they have a much lower percentage than, say 40 to 45. And so having that kind of 5% piece there, I think is really great. I don't know about the minimum thresholds in the table. And then just as far as long-term planning, if we're doing well, actually, no, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you all for your really thoughtful feedback and preparation with a lot of dense material coming into this meeting. Really appreciate that. I'd like to take a moment to reflect on our conversations today, specifically around the racial equity considerations. I know there was mention a few times now about needing to solve for that intersection of very low income people and people of color, and how that relates to homeownership, but also other opportunities and choice, and trying to figure out, maybe look more closely if the contextualized housing need assumptions or HPS actions that are on the table are getting us far enough, or if more needs to be done. So more to be considered on that. But I would like to just check in with you all on the other parts of the racial equity framework, especially the data justice, data equity, which we heard a little bit about, and accountability, and see if you have reflections on how well we did at least surfacing some issues, or if there's some other ideas that we should have picked up on that you would like DLCD to think about a little more closely as they write the rules. Go ahead, Shannon.
I was just really going to share appreciation for the nuanced approach to areas of opportunity. And I just think there was a lot of thoughtfulness that seemed evidenced there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Other reflections on racial equity considerations that we did or did not tackle today?
this is maybe adjacent to that, but one concern I have about the sort of the nature of the either you well the requirement or the safe harbor that you would be allowing the model code, which is quite liberal in all multifamily zones effectively. In addition to whatever else CHN might push you to, it creates a big bump, and I worry that it reduces the incentive for cities ever to upzone exclusive areas and thus fight segregation to some extent, unless they're forced to. And so the answers to that are either we solve for the ever-present problem of the drive for separation and segregation in our society, or there has to be something preventing us from, or there has to be something forcing cities to not do that, right? So there needs to be some sort it's one more reminder for me that, like, if we're going to hold multifamily zoning to a high standard, which we should, then we also need to be holding the amount of land on which multifamily zoning is allowed to a pretty high standard, regardless of the supply calculations, but because that's part of housing choice. And we don't want to accidentally disincentivize allowing housing choice by setting a high standard for multifamily zoning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing you say, well, sorry, the thought just left my brain, but I think, yes, thinking about those areas of especially racial segregation and the role that zoning can or should play in addressing segregation, especially areas where people of color are locked out. Is that part of what you're saying, Michael?
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that we need to make sure that we're actually zoning for a fair amount of land to be liberally zoned enough for poor people and less wealthy people to live there, because that is going to become a means of racial segregation if we aren't not only looking at the market need for multifamily zoning, but allowing for enough land to be multifamily zoned if people want to live in that location.
Enough areas with enough choice.
Yeah, within the jurisdiction. Yeah.
Got it. Sean, some additional perspectives on that? No? Yes? Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to wrap us up then. Maybe, Thea, could you just verbally give us a little highlight about next steps and where we're headed from here, please?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for this great conversation. Just want to loop back. We will be rejoining you all in August 20th, to present our...
Oh. Uh-oh. Thea disappeared. Present the first draft of the rules, August 20th. Sorry, Thea, you locked up there for a minute.
our classic DLCD noon glitch.
That's right. I forgot about
Sorry,
that.
everybody. Yeah, I will follow up with a little next steps and some other information. So look for that in your inbox.
Yep. So draft rules coming next. And in the meantime, please send any additional comments you have from today's discussion as soon as possible, because they're starting to draft those rules. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time and attention. And we'll see you in a month.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all. Enjoy the summer.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
For the staff team, I just sent you guys that suggested language. Oh, never mind. They're gone. Okay.